I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have a full committee hearing this morning to discuss the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorizing Budget Request for the Department of the Navy. And we are joined by three witnesses this morning. The Honorable Thomas Modly, Acting Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Michael Gilday, Chief of Naval Operations, and General David Berger, the Commandant for the U.S. Marine Corps. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Appreciate your willingness to testify and also your service to our country. All the work that you do to help make sure that we have our strongest military we possibly can and meet our national security objectives. We kicked off our posture hearing season yesterday with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I think got a pretty good overview of the overall budget. And now we are going to work our way through piece by piece. And I think the most interesting thing is what the Department of Defense has undertaken, that I know you all are participating in as well, that has come to be called the blank slate review. Basically an effort to look at everything that we are doing within the military and reassess. Figure out where we could potentially save money, where we should spend more, and how we need to realign our priorities to make sure that they match up with the national security strategy that was put in place over a year ago now, I believe. The overarching theme of that is the notion of great power competition and the reemergence of that, which reemerged a while ago, but dealing with Russia and China and how that enabled, how we should realign our forces and realign our defense priorities to meet that challenge. And I think that is the most difficult question, and one that we definitely want to hear from all of you today in terms of how it specifically impacts the Navy and the Marine Corps. What do you need to do differently? Where are you short assets? Where can assets be transferred from? And how do we balance all of those complex needs? And the great challenge here, of course, is we do not have infinite resources. The budget is what the budget is. So if we come to you and say, we want you to do more here, logically, you're going to have to do less somewhere else. I do realize that efficiencies are part of that. We discussed a little bit yesterday the move towards an audit, trying to make sure that we create greater efficiency in the acquisition and procurement process. I know Ranking Member Thornberry has done an enormous amount of work on that. All of that done, we still have to make choices within the budget. And you gentlemen are in the position to best understand those choices and why you've made the ones you have. So hearing from you how you prioritize where you want the money spent is going to be enormously important. We are specifically concerned, and I know Congressman Courtney will express these concerns better than I can, about some of the reductions in the shipbuilding accounts and money that apparently was transferred around in the President's budget at the last minute that among other things, required the reduction of one attack submarine, how we're going to meet those needs. And overall in that area, I am interested in, we've been talking about a 355-ship Navy, I think, for the entire time that I've been in Congress. I think they had a different number when I started, but I forget what that number was. It's almost meaningless at this point, since it's like 20, 30 years out. We're going to try to get to that number. What I'm more interested in is what do we have now? What are we likely to have in the next 5 years? How does it meet our needs, and how do we plan for the future? It's great to have goals, I suppose, and we can aspire towards that number, but at this point, it seems like just that, an aspiration. It doesn't translate necessarily into a strategy, so I'm more interested in how the short-term strategy works on that front. So we look forward to your testimony, and we have many questions, and it will help inform us as we get ready to produce the National Defense Authorizing Act this year. And with that, I turn it over to the Ranking Member, Mr. Thornberry, for any opening comments he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming our witnesses today and also thanking each of them for their service and their many contributions to the country's defense. As Chairman referenced, there was considerable conversation yesterday with the Secretary and the Chairman about Navy shipbuilding. It was interesting to me, one of the benefits the Chairman and I have is we get to be here from the front till the beginning to the end of these hearings. And while there was a lot of concern about this year's budget, as the conversation evolved, there seemed to be more questions about, okay, where's the Navy headed in a longer term sense? not just numbers of ships, but characteristics of ships and capabilities and so forth. And so I do think members are interested to get that sort of where we're headed, and that will enable us to do a better job not only this year but in the future. And similarly, reference was made to potential changes coming to the Marine Corps. And so I think while we will focus, of course, on this year's budget, as the chairman referenced, changes in warfare, moving from as much emphasis on counterterrorism toward great power competition, means that all the services will have to make some changes, maybe year two as much as any. So we look forward to hearing from you, and again, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Motley.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for your bipartisan efforts on behalf of our sailors, Marines, and civilians in the Department of the Navy. It's a true honor for me to be here today with Admiral Gilday and General Berger, both of whom have demonstrated great commitment to each other and to each other's respective naval service as they have worked collaboratively to lead our integrated American naval force. Consistent with that spirit, we've taken a different approach to the written testimony this year, as you've received. We've submitted one unified document instead of three separate statements. And staying ahead in today's rapidly changing global strategic environment demands that our naval forces commit to unified planning, clear-eyed assessments, and sometimes some very, very hard choices. In this process, we must harmonize competing priorities, sustain our critical industrial base, and not allow our maritime competitive advantage to erode relative to global competitors and, more accurately stated, aggressive adversaries who wish to hasten our decline as a global force for liberty and decency around the world. In the end, this budget submission is a manifestation of the hard choices we had to make this year, but it is centrally about our sailors and Marines, their safety and their security and their well-being and their families. Ultimately, I ask that you recognize that in this submission, we could not make trades that put our sailors and Marines on platforms and with equipment that are not ready for a fight if that fight is what is required of them. While this budget does slow our trajectory to a force of 355 ships or more, it does not arrest it. You have my personal assurance that we are still deeply committed to building that larger, more capable, more distributed naval force within what I consider a strategically relevant time frame of no more than 10 years. I look forward to working with this committee and the entire Congress in the coming months as we develop realistic plans to do so. Our budget also demonstrates a clear commitment to the education of our people as we implement the recommendations of the Education for Sea Power study that I led while serving as the Undersecretary of the Navy for the last 2 years. We are establishing a Naval Community College for our enlisted personnel as part of a bold and unified naval education strategy that recognizes that the intellectual and ethical development of our people is going to be the most critical element of our success as a naval force. We are also stepping up our efforts to meet our solemn commitment to our military families through significantly more engaged oversight and accountability of our public-private venture housing program. Finally, I would like this committee to understand that as leaders of the Department of the Navy, we are both vocal and united in our determination to prevent sexual assault and sexual harassment throughout our force. Every sailor, every Marine, and every Navy civilian deserves individual dignity, respect, and protection from this great naval institution that we have the honor to lead. We have a lot of work to do in this regard, but you have my personal commitment that we take it very, very seriously, and we're going after it every day. We are grateful to the committee for passing this year's NDAA, which enables many of the priorities identified within this document. In passing this legislation, you've sent a strong signal of support to our people and a stern warning to our adversaries around the world. We also appreciate the funding stability and predictability of the last several years. This has saved a lot of money for the American taxpayers and given our force the agility and flexibility to address emerging threats while investing in our integrated force. We urge this committee to do what it can to continue this stability in the future so that we can implement the reforms and investments required to meet the great power challenges we face. protect the maritime commons, and defend the United States of America. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral Gilday, you were going to make a statement? We were... Okay, go ahead.
Chairman Smith.
And if you could be sure and pull the microphone down in front of you there.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, good morning. And thank you for the opportunity to appear today with Secretary Moodley and General Berger, and for your enduring support of the Navy Marine Corps team. I'd also like to point out that my wife, Linda, joins me this morning. I'll be brief, sir. I'd like to address some of the points that both of you made in your opening statements, and this really gets down to priorities. So in our budget submission for this year, the Navy has 4 priorities. The first is to fully fund the Columbia-class submarine. So that nuclear seaborne deterrent that this nation depends upon is aging out. By the time we replace the Ohio hull, it'll have 42 years in the water. And so we need to deliver Columbia on time for its first patrol in 2031. Numbers 2 and 3 are readiness and lethality. We are catching up and closing gaps that we've created over the past 15 to 20 years. And so in order to come to this committee and ask for more money for a larger fleet, we need to make sure that we can maintain and sustain the fleet that we have. And so those are 2 priorities for us, and our budget reflects that. In terms of lethality, we are closing gaps against near-peer competitors by investing in capabilities that have range and that have speed. 21% of our budget is invested in closing those gaps against our near-peer competitor. While we're doing those top 3 priorities, we are still investing in capacity. The size of the fleet is growing. It's just not growing at the pace that some would prefer. And to meet those priorities, we've had to make some hard choices inside the Navy. And that includes decommissioning some legacy platforms that don't bring lethality to the fight. So with those comments, sir, I thank you again for your time this morning.
Thank you. General Berger.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of this committee.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the posture of your Marine Corps and our priorities for our future. And I'll start by echoing Secretary Moodley and Admiral Gilday's thanks for timely funding, as well as your enduring commitment to Marines, sailors, and their families through efforts like the hurricane recovery effort and funding that you provided last year, and the revision to the public-private venture housing program. Your bipartisan support is critical to ensure that we continue to prioritize people as our greatest resource. Thanks to predictable funding over the past few years, your Marine Corps has made significant progress in restoring both availability and readiness. We are now at an inflection point. We have to pivot now toward modernization while sustaining the readiness that this committee has resourced. This pivot, in my opinion, cannot wait until next year or the following. We must move now, or risk overmatch in the future by an adversary, and that is a risk we will not take. As the National Defense Strategy directs, and as Secretary Moodley recently emphasized in his first vector to all hands, we must pursue urgent change at a significant scale. Marines have always sensed when it's time to move out smartly. We don't hesitate. This is that time. Realizing the bold direction of our strategic guidance requires acknowledging fundamental changes in the operating environment, and that means how we must train, organize, and equip the force. I believe most leaders recognize that significant changes are required, yet the scope and pace of necessary change is seemingly at odds with some historical resource allocations and major acquisition programs which predate the National Defense Strategy. This budget submission marks the beginning for the Marine Corps of a focused effort to better align resources with strategic objectives. Our future budget submissions will build on these investment decisions with informed recommendations for force design modifications and adjustment to our programs of record. Together, in partnership with Admiral Gilday and under the direction of Secretary Moodley, we are committed to delivering the integrated naval and marine forces that our nation requires. As always, I welcome the opportunity to discuss our findings along the way and keep each of you and your staffs informed as we progress. We will be frugal with the resources we are given. We will ask for no more than we need. With Congress's commitment and support, we will ensure your Marines continue to have every advantage when we send them into harm's way. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Could you, as a starting point, quantify for us the readiness gains, where we were at, where we've come to, how much further we need to go, taking your point on the procurement needs now that are paramount. Explain to us where you're at in readiness, where you were, where you're at, where you think you need to be.
Chairman, if I'd probably just use a couple examples. First of all, TAC Air, fixed-wing aviation. 3 years ago, if memory serves me right, we were in the mid to upper 50s across the F-18 and Harrier community, and we were just introducing the F-35. And 50% is not the readiness that you all expect. Last year, the goal that the Secretary outlined and we both strove towards was 80%, and we in fact achieved that. We would never have made that without the resources that Congress provided. Ground side, similar picture. Because of Iraq and Afghanistan, we had rode our forces, our equipment pretty hard, and we had postponed maintenance. The last 2 or 3 years, we have recovered that.
Terrific, thank you. Admiral, could you help me out with the 355 ship thing? I think it is really important, as the ranking member pointed out, what are the capabilities we need? What are the specific types of ship? How do you sort of balance that focus in terms of what types of ship you're building, what capabilities you need, with the off-stated goal of having 355 ships? And when is it? I forget the date when we're supposed to achieve that number. How do those two things mesh in terms of your plans? I don't think you marked. There we go.
To your point, it is about capabilities. And so when we take a look at what we need in the Navy as part of the Joint Force, we're taking a look at what unique capabilities the Navy can bring to the fight that other services can't. And so it is a analytical approach within the Pentagon to try and make the best investments now to close capability gaps against both the Chinese and the Russians. So a couple of examples of the Navy in terms of the air wings that are embarked on aircraft carriers. So no other place in the military do we have an airfield that I can move 700 miles a day and at the same time provide the integrated capability of early warning, electronic attack, anti-submarine warfare, air-to-ground, air-to-air, and logistics. All the while you have a self-sustaining platform that, again, is mobile. At the same time, we bring unique capabilities with respect to ballistic missile defense and anti-submarine warfare on our destroyers and with our submarines as well. And so those fold into that joint mix in terms of what the Navy can contribute to the joint fight, and that translates into platforms. And so simply that's kind of the quadratic equation that yields a number of ships, but it also takes into account attrition models in a fight. It also takes into account what other missions we need to conduct around the globe in accordance with the National Defense Strategy. So that would include deterring another near-peer competitor conventionally, strategically, being able to respond to additional threats, assuring allies and partners. Those also fold into the equation, as well as a strategic reserve bench in case we do get into.
So sorry, but what's the point of the 355 goal? Mr. Motley, if you want.
Chairman, do you mind if I address this question? So it's not a random number. It's a number that's basically benchmarked off of a study that was done in 2016, the force structure assessment.
But when is it that we're saying that we're going to need the 355 ships?
I'm sorry, sir. I did.
When are we planning on?
Well, it's my objective to try to get us there within 10 years. That is a strategy I'm trying to drive through, and it's not just a random number. It's driven by strategy. It's driven by the capabilities we think we need. I will also say it's improper for us to be benchmarking against a static number. What we're trying to develop in the Department of the Navy is more of an iterative process to look at that number so that we can understand how we might adjust certain ship categories based on how we perceive the security environment evolving. The security environment is not static. We have to develop a force that's agile, that we can quickly adjust certain ship categories as we see that we need them. We just completed an integrated force structure assessment that was led by the Commandant and the CNO for the first time together, trying to determine, as we look at that future security environment in a 10-year horizon, and we have to take it with some reality here, because it takes a long time to get ships designed and built and into an industrial base that can support it. But in the 10-year horizon, as we looked at those numbers again, they actually ended up increasing. But the mix is different. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that it's the 355 was pegged to a force structure assessment that was done 4 years ago. We are trying to develop a process in the Navy where we constantly look at this, constantly iterate this, give good signals to industry so they can adjust with it.
Understood. One last question on that. So looking at that 10-year goal, how does the money that was taken out of shipbuilding that cost us that submarine, number one, in this budget, which was not in the original president's budget, that was taken out, as I understand it, to fund the NNSA at a higher level. How does that, plus the cuts that you're now facing from the money being reprogrammed for the wall and the programs that are cut, how do those things impact your ability to meet those goals?
Well, to be frank, it's not helpful because it takes a ship out of a plan that we're driving towards. It particularly is harmful in the sense that it takes a ship out of a category of ship for which we're going to have a hard time getting to anyway. We feel like we need to have at least 66 attack submarines. Even on the 10-year trajectory, based on industrial base capacity, we think we can get to about 49 or 50. So it takes out one. If we can get to 48 instead of 49, that impacts that number. But that's, so of course, any ship that comes out of the process of in any given year is going to impact our ability to get there as quickly as I'd like to. So,
thank you. Mr. Thornberry.
As I look at the numbers, the shipbuilding account is down, what, about $4 billion from last year, and the readiness O&M account for the Navy is up about $3.6 billion from last year. Basically, the same. The cuts and the increases. So could either of you, Ms. Secretary or Admiral, give me a little deeper explanation for why the emphasis needs to be, in your view, on the O&M part this year?
I'll take it initially, and then I'll turn it over to the CNO. But I think what I tried to basically say in my opening statement was we did make that trade. It was an intentional trade because our decision was that at this particular time, because of the readiness hole that we had fallen into over many, many years, we needed to address that first and foremost, because that immediately impacts the safety and security of the sailors and Marines that we put out on these platforms. We could not in good conscience trade that money for more ships that could not operate properly. With the right equipment and with the right readiness. And so that's the trade we made. We have to look now, as we look from 22 forward, how do we afford this larger Navy and maintain the readiness? And those are the challenges, and that's being pressurized by a lot of things, such as the Columbia recapitalization, which is a necessary part of our national security. But we are looking internally to see what we can do to look at our own budget first to see what we can do to find additional funds to drive that.
And Admiral, as you describe this, can you give us, you got what, ships that are not deployable? Kind of what is this readiness priority in a practical, concrete way?
Yes, sir. So big picture, I believe that we need a Navy that's ready, that's capable and lethal, more than we need a bigger Navy that's less ready, less capable, less lethal. And so the money that we're putting into the readiness accounts, right, specifically if we talk about manpower. So when I commanded a destroyer, we had over 300 sailors on a destroyer. We went down to 245. We had collisions in the Pacific. We learned a lot, lessons learned in blood. We're now buying that manpower back. We'll be at 265 this year. We'll come out to 285 in those destroyers in 2023 as an example. We have gaps at sea. Those gaps need to be filled so our ships are fully manned for all the reasons that you well know. So we are buying back those people. There are years when the Navy has shedded people faster than we shedded ships, and the size of the Navy has declined since I've been in uniform in 1985. But the people piece is where you can get money fast. and it's a really attractive place to go after money, and we're saying we're not going to do that. We're going to buy back that manpower that we know that we need on our ships. In terms of training for that manpower, what we also learned from those collisions, that we need to do a much better job at training our sailors at sea. We've put significant investments in live virtual training, as an example, simulators that are world-class, and we have those at all of our fleet concentration areas. In terms of modernization, so we're modernizing our ships. We've taken a holiday for a while and keeping up with a 70% of the fleet that we have today we're going to have in 2030. And so we have to take care of that fleet. So in terms of modernization, we're putting new systems on there to make our ships more lethal. And we're filling the magazines with weapons. And the investments we're making in weapons are those that have range and speed. So for years, we've invested in defensive systems because we haven't had a hot breath down the back of our neck. Now that hot breath is China. So we're closing those gaps. That essentially is, I hope, answered your question on why that's where the focus is, at the expense of growing a Navy at a precipitous pace. And so,
Okay. Let me just ask one other question. Lots of flack yesterday about not having a 30-year shipbuilding plan come with the budget. Any idea when we might see such a thing?
Representative Thornberry, the issue with the 30-year shipbuilding plan is that we developed this integrated force structure assessment, and we presented it to the Secretary of Defense. He wanted some time and some space to look at that, analyze it, and understand how that would impact a 30-year shipbuilding plan. So unfortunately, it was a confluence of events this year that we submitted our budget, the force structure assessment was delivered, and we didn't have time to really iterate that, talk to him about it, test it, before we submitted a 30-year shipbuilding plan. But we will work with him. Hopefully in a couple months, we'll be able to submit that.
Okay, thank you.
So 2 quick things before we go to the rest of the questioning. First of all, we have a 5-minute clock for everyone, and the witnesses need to be helpful to me. Once you get down close to that 5 minutes, if you could try to wrap up so that I don't have to interrupt you, that would be great. Second, Mr. Garamendi has an introduction he wants to do quickly.
If I might, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly, the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima is upon us. Wandering into my office today is a 98-year-old veteran of Hiroshima, Purple Heart. Clinton Tofena is down here in the front row. His unit was the first on the beach, an engineering unit. He was wounded in that battle, and I'd like to welcome him. And General, Commandant, he said he's got a few things he can tell you about how to do it right.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, John.
He was just recently given his new license from the California Department of Vehicles. Highway Patrol caught him a couple of days after that, traveling at over 100 miles an hour, and when the highway patrolman said, do you know how fast he was going? He said, yes, 2 miles an hour over my age.
Thank you. On that note, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for your service to our country and certainly for being with us today. I wanted to go back to the issue that we began talking about yesterday. And as you may know, I had asked General Milley about the cut to the Virginia-class submarine. We've referenced that already today, to increase nuclear weapons programs. And he said that while he supported fully funding the nuclear arsenal, the last-minute change was not supported by his best military advice. And I know that's been mentioned again. Could you share your thoughts about that so we have a better understanding about how that occurred? I was addressing that to the Admiral, but Mr. Secretary, do you want to?
Ma'am, I was not directly involved in those discussions. It happened at budget endgame very quickly, and we were informed after the decision was made.
Okay, and Mr. Secretary, I think you addressed it already.
Exactly the way I have to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful, and maybe further discussions about how, again, Congress can play a stronger role in that as well. In this budget, shipbuilding has also seen cuts in logistics and support vessels like oilers. And I wonder if you could talk about the way forward with those programs as well. Where are we? Where should we be going?
Yes, ma'am, thanks. As you probably know, we have a new class of oiler that we're building, and we'll reach its initial operating capability in just a couple of years. So we're replacing an aging fleet of oilers. We're also beginning to make investments in strategic sea lift. And so that's another area of the budget, just like the Columbia-class submarine, just like our infrastructure ashore, where we haven't made significant investments in a while. So the Congress has given us the authorities to buy used vessels. And so we were buying 2 used vessels in 2021, and the authority is to buy up to 7 of those. At the same time, we're doing R&D in a new class of affordable sea lift platform. At the same time, we did service life extension on 6 of our older ships last year. We're going to double that this year, and we're going to triple that next year in 21 with this request. I hope that answers your question, ma'am, in terms of...
Sure, and you feel that that's going to get us where we need to be?
No, ma'am.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so
Where do we need to be?
we take a look at pressure points within our top line, and that's among them. We are giving it attention, but it's just a long time to catch up with that aging fleet, given its size.
Thank you. The Navy, as you know, has been offering unmanned systems and has developed multiple programs of record on systems that were never fielded. In FY21, the Navy proposed the serial production of the large unmanned surface vessel before prototyping and testing are complete. Considering the history, is it prudent to continue serial production of large unmanned surface vessels before the prototyping and testing are complete? Mr. Secretary, you want to answer?
Yes, absolutely. Well, we have to really accelerate our investment in unmanned platforms, and that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do it on a reasonable pace so that we can understand how these technologies might work, and more importantly, how they might operate together. So without having the platforms, it's very difficult for us to do that type of testing, that type of integrated testing that we would need to do. So we are proceeding, we think, in a somewhat cautious pace to do this, but it's absolutely going to be part of whatever future force structure we have. And so we need to start experimenting with concepts, understanding how the technology will work.
Thank you. You know that the Navy struggles to forecast ship depot maintenance. That's a big, tough issue for everybody. And has recently requested congressional approval to cover approximately $1 billion of shortfalls in this account. This creates unpredictability, of course, for industry and diminishes Congress's confidence that the Navy is effectively managing this huge and critical enterprise. What are you doing to better predict the schedule and costs of ships and submarine maintenance availabilities?
Ma'am, I'm mindful of the time, Mr. Chairman, but so as you point out, we've had challenges with depot-level maintenance on our ships. Most recently, we've only been able to get about 30 to 35% of our ships out of the shipyards on time. That's been a priority of the Navy to turn that around. We want to reduce 80% of our delay days this year. Right now, 63% of our ships are coming out of maintenance on time through 20. And we want to eliminate all those delays by the end of 21. So it's very aggressively. We've done a lot of analytical work. We found out, as an example, that many of the delays, about 25%, could be attributed to poor forecasting and planning up front. That's our fault in the Navy. And so we took a round turn on that. Additionally, we're taking a look at bundling contracts for private...
And we will have to leave it at that. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here. And I particularly appreciate you being here. I'm a grateful Navy dad, and I have a son who's been an orthopedic surgeon and serving today, has previously served in Iraq with the SEALs and the Rangers. So we just so appreciate our family being part of the Navy family. Additionally, Secretary Modly, the National Defense Strategy lays out the rebuilding military readiness as we face a more lethal joint force as a distinct line of effort. The Navy's FY21 requests for F-35 Joint Strike Fighters include 5 less than last year and 6 less than FY19. Topping the Navy's unfunded priorities list, however, is $525.5 million for 5 F-35C carrier variants. How is the naval readiness and ultimately military readiness impacted by these aircraft not being funded, and what is the Navy's plan to compensate for the shortfall?
Well, as you know, sir, we did put that in. It's the number 2 item on our unfunded priorities list. We would obviously love to have those aircraft, but again, when we got into the final budget deliberations, we felt that we could trade that without severely impacting our readiness over the long term and try to pick it up in future years.
Thank you. And General Berger, I previously represented Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort, and one of the great achievements was for that community that just really loves the Marine Corps Air Station. They love the sound of freedom, all right, when it flies over. They do not complain. And so that's why they help recruit and support F-35s to be located there. By replacing the 4th-generation planes at Beaufort with 5th-generation aircraft, what is the current process and what challenges do you foresee?
Sir, 2.5 years ago, we sent the first squadron to Iwakuni. Last year, they went on ship. A year and a half ago, they went on ship. We're moving fast. In our view, comparing the Harrier against the F-35 is pretty striking. And all you need to do is listen to the media in Indo-Pacific on the other side to find out what the impact of a squadron of F-35s on board an amphibious ship floating around out there. There's no difference, or there's no comparison. In Beaufort, on the east and west coast, moving as fast as we can to get out of F-18s and Harriers and into F-35s. That is our goal.
Well, we appreciate it, and they are, if ever there's a community that will welcome it, it's Beaufort, South Carolina, and the state of South Carolina. And Admiral Gilday, I'm grateful that the Navy is fielding W76-2 low-yield warheads earlier this month. The Nuclear Posture Review identifies the requirement to modify a small number of submarine-launched ballistic missile warheads to combat potential adversaries with low-yield nuclear weapons for peace through strength. However, the W76-2 is one of 2 variants of the W76, which just completed its service life extension program. These systems will require modernization in the coming years as their cores are increasingly older. What steps is the Navy taking to ensure the seamless modernization of these systems and to ensure that the naval readiness is not impacted by the growing nuclear threat?
Yes, sir. Thanks for the question about low-yield nuclear weapons. We are making investments right now in modernizing our nuclear weapons inventory, and so that's included in that plan. That'll take a number of years in order to close, but it is included.
Well, I particularly appreciate it because I know the Savannah River Nuclear Laboratory is very vital and very, again, enthusiastic to work with you. Sadly, in 2017, I visited the Fitzgerald in Japan, which so many American sailors were tragically and to me just shockingly killed. What lessons have we learned? What steps have we taken to avoid any further accidents such as the Fitzgerald and the McCain?
Yes, sir. I know you're aware of the comprehensive review we've done and the phases we've gone through in order to institutionalize what we learned from both of those collisions. I will actually be traveling to Pascagoula, Mississippi tomorrow, and I'll be aboard the Fitzgerald, and we're going to talk about many of those issues.
And I hope every effort's made for an early warning advanced system for the best for our sailors.
Sir,
Thank you, and I'm grateful to be and yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Secretary Modley, Admiral Gilday, and General Berger for being here today, for your testimony, and all that you do on behalf of our nation. I want to begin by applauding your efforts with the recent Education for Sea Power study to enhance professional military education and increase opportunities for our enlisted sailors and Marines to earn accredited technical degrees. I think it's absolutely essential that we continue to educate all of our service members wherever possible and provide them these opportunities. It was a big priority for a former chairman of this committee, Ike Skelton, who believed greatly in professional military education, and something that has stuck with me during my time here on the committee. On another topic, I appreciate both the chairman and my colleague, Ms. Davis, for raising the concern about the cut to the Virginia-class submarine in this year's presidential budget. I don't think it's the time that we should be cutting, and it does concern me, Admiral, that that decision was made after the fact and not, it seems, with your input. That does not inspire confidence here that we're making decisions based on our military needs versus what some may be doing with playing around with budget numbers. But that being said, Secretary Modly, in your recent Vector 12, you emphasized the importance of continued increased undersea dominance for the long run. The most obviously survivable leg of the nuclear triad, the Columbia-class submarine, is essential to that mission. My question, Secretary Modly or Admiral Gilday, is the Columbia-class submarine vital for our success in great power competition? And would you agree that the Columbia-class submarine is a strategic asset that will benefit more than just the Navy?
Sir, I absolutely agree that it is probably the most vital part of our strategic nuclear deterrent. The current force is aging and has to be modernized, so that is why it's #1 on our priority in terms of as we looked at this budget and how we intended to roll it out. It is going to be even more relevant in a more complicated world with powers who have greater ability to project power both under the sea and in other areas. And so it is absolutely vital to our future, and that's why it's such a priority for us in our budget.
So this asset will carry 70% of the nuclear arsenal, and yet the Navy seems to be the only one covering the bill. Secretary Modly or Admiral Gilday, do you believe that the Navy is shouldering a disproportionate share for this asset?
Well, we work under the top line that we're given to work under, sir, and so that's how we're managing it. We prioritize it. I think there are a lot of discussions being held both in the halls here and other places about how we might come up with more creative ways to fund that program, because frankly, it's putting a huge pressure on our shipbuilding budget. It's 25% now. It's going to escalate to 31%. And if we also have this goal of growing a fleet to 355, or I like to say 355 plus, we're not going to be able to do all those things. So we're digging hard inside our own budget to see where we can free up dollars for this. There may be some creative ways to look at unexpired or unused or unobligated funds to try and fund that, but we're looking at every possible way to do that but we can't abandon it. So,
well, I would agree, and I think you'd find support here on the committee. We need to get creative because this is a national strategic asset, and I don't think we should be taking it just out of the shipbuilding budget. But to this point, what steps are you and OSD taking to ensure the Columbia-class submarines procurement timeline remains less volatile than our current experience with Virginia-class? Admiral Gilday, I'm glad to hear you talk about how that we are committed to fully funding Columbia, but what are the steps we're taking to make sure that procurement timeline
Probably the
stays on
best
track?
example I can give you, Congressman, is the fact that when we begin building that submarine later this year, 83% of that submarine will be designed. If I compare that against Ohio, 2% of that submarine was designed when we started building it. Virginia-class, less than half of that submarine was completed design by the time we started building it. So it's vitally important, for the reasons stated previously, to stay in the timeline to begin its first patrol in 2031, that we absolutely remain focused on it. And the teamwork with the shipyards is absolutely critical here in order to stay on that timeline as well.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service and for your availability today. Admiral Gilday, to address a gap in the Homeland Defense due to program cancellations, Missile Defense Agency is looking at a regional defense system to serve as an underlayer to the GMD system. Specifically, they're looking at the Aegis Ashore using the SM-3 Block 2A missiles. How would that impact your BMD mission?
Sir, it would allow us to use BMD-capable ships for other missions besides defending the homeland. And so I think it would give more flexibility to senior decision makers in terms of how they would use those assets if that gap were covered with a land-based Aegis system with essentially the same capability as the ships.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the land-based system. Has there been discussion about moving the Aegis ashore from the Navy to the Army, given that there's talk about expanding that capability?
Sir, not that I'm aware of.
Great. Over the last decade, we've seen significant growth in the Chinese battle fleet, and they've surpassed the United States now as the largest Navy. We're seeing significant investments by both Russia and North Korea in their submarine technologies and capacity. How do you compete with that?
Sir, so I go back to the priorities, right, in terms of making sure that the fleet we have today, 70% of which we're going to have in 2030, is ready and capable to fight. That 21% of our budget is focused on lethality and modernization so that we have weapons that can actually outstick our adversaries with great speed. And that includes doubling our investment in hypersonics. And so we're working very closely with the Army and the Air Force as we develop not only the airframe that we should begin doing testing here together very soon, but also the warheads.
Thank you. General Berger, you talked in your opening statement about this being an inflection point and that we can't waste time, we have to start acting now. But when I look at your PB21 numbers, I don't see much difference between PB20. What am I missing? If we really got to do something now, why is it not reflected in larger numbers in the PB21?
This year is the pivot. This budget was largely built in July and August based on our annual fiscal cycle. So I could fit some things, I could change some things, but not the significant ones that we need to make. In 22 and 23, it will be significantly more. But even in this one, there's investments in things like ground-based anti-ship missiles that you wouldn't have seen a couple years ago at all. But this is the direction the integrated force must go.
Great. In your written testimony, you also talked about an acquisition review of legacy programs. You talked about F-35, the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, and the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, and others. And like you said, we may have to turn loose to some legacy programs. When do you think that review is going to be complete and ready for you to take action?
I think much like the integrated force structure assessment in terms of ships, it's not going to be ever over because we have an adversary that's moving. So we've completed the first round of it. We know the size of the Marine Corps that we're going to need, we think, in 10 years from now. And much of the capabilities and capacities are driven by the size of your force. We'll need to make adjustments to the programs of record based on a couple things. First, the size of the Marine Corps. We're not going to waste the resources you give us. Second, the threat. We have to match, we have to maintain an overmatch all along. So as long as we're in great power competition, we are going to gauge off of a pacing threat, which means we're going to increase, decrease.
From our previous conversations, I very much like the aggressive approach that you're taking. I'm just wondering when we're going to start seeing you take the knife out and start taking some action. Will that be in the 22 budget or what?
This year, in this budget, we reduced the manpower equivalent of a couple thousand Marines. That probably won't be the largest one or the last. Why? I think every service chief would love to have a bigger force, but you need us to be lethal, you need us to be mobile, you need us to be integrated with the Navy. So we're going to reduce the size of the Marine Corps, some this year, more next year. You'll see the impacts to programs, I think, later this summer and into the spring of next year. But again, it'll be it's not a snapshot in time where we freeze, or else an evolving threat. We'll stare at a signpost and he'll be moving.
Well, I like your leadership on this. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson.
Thank you. Secretary Modley and Admiral Gilday, the FY2020 NDAA included a provision that required the SecNav to conduct real-time sound monitoring at no fewer than 2 Navy installations and their associated outlying landing fields. And so we have a very parochial interest there, trying to deal with some issues around NAS Whidbey Island and OLF. But I think this is a good compromise step, moving away from the traditional model that we've used and moved to real-time noise monitoring. The plan, though, for additional monitoring is due to Congress by March 20th, according to the language in the law. So is the Navy planning to submit that plan to Congress on time?
Sir, my understanding that they're wrapping up that study and that it's on track to be delivered on time.
So the plan for the study is due on March 20th, and then the implementation then would
That's right.
would occur. So you're saying by March 20th we'll have the plan.
I have not heard anything otherwise in terms of our ability. I will check into that for sure and get back to you, sir.
You know, earlier is better, certainly. So so then with that plan, I then assume the Navy is prepared to begin implementing the real-time monitoring soon after.
Sir, I'll get back to you on that one, sir. I was just reading about that this morning, that they were preparing to deliver this plan, but I have not seen it yet. So once I know more of the details, I'll get back to you on that, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch. Appreciate that. And then second, for the Secretary or Admiral, you can choose really. The EPA signed interim guidance in December providing recommendations to address groundwater contaminated with PFAS and PFOS. And we've had this debate here. And of course, again, we have the issue on Whidbey Island, and we'll note the Navy's commitment to Whidbey Island has been great in helping the city of Coopville deal with their well situation, but we still have groundwater issues there. Is the Navy following the EPA guidance, continuing to follow the EPA guidance?
Sir, so we finished our investigations, and in areas like Coopville where we found contamination, we have taken steps, for example, to provide suitable drinking water from other sources. We have money in the budget this year, about $60 million, to address cleanup, and so we're moving through cleanup in 20 and 21. So so in both 20 and 21, we have money towards cleanup, and the last report that I saw, that we were on track to conduct that cleanup on time.
Excellent. We'll follow up with you on that too. There may be some. I think every community is unique, and we have some unique issues there at NAS Whidbey Island and Coopville as well. So we'll follow up with you on that. I appreciate that. Third question I have has to do with the readiness question, especially as it applies to the F-18s, specifically the Gs. The Growlers are at NAS Whidbey Island, and again, it's a Growler question. But what is the given the percentages you've outlined with the Es and Fs? Do you know the readiness level of the Gs?
Yes, sir. It's over 60% right now. What we've learned a lot from what we've done with the Super Hornets, right? The Es and the Fs, and so we were at 50. We could not break 55% mission-capable aircraft for a decade, and so we took a deep look at our processes, and we're applying those same to our ship's maintenance. So we've now been sustaining above 80% for 4 or 5 months. So we're applying those same processes to every type, model, series aircraft in the inventory. So I expect that the Growler numbers will come up. They're headed in the right direction.
Excellent. So if, apologize, it's kind of a leading question, because if we can get to 80% plus on the Gs, does that change the number of Growlers that the Navy will need?
No, sir. It won't change. It won't change the requirement. We just have a more ready fleet.
Okay. I think that's it. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your service, for your contribution, and Admiral, for your wife as well, and what she contributes. I'd like to ask you about conventional prompt strike, presumably with a hypersonic glide vehicle. What is the need for such a submarine-launched capability, Admiral or Acting Secretary?
Well, one of the great challenges we have right now is that our adversaries have developed long-range hypersonic missiles that hold our forces at bay, make us have to operate farther and farther away from the first and second island chains. And so we have to develop some type of capability to be able to meet that. And so that's why we're developing this conventional prompt strike weapon, and we're working with the Army and the Air Force on this collaboratively. We are looking at all kinds of different options for how we might base that, some of which I can't discuss in an open forum, but would be happy to come in a closed forum and talk to you about that. So.
And we are talking about a conventional capability, not strategic or nuclear, but conventional. Would that affect strategic stability? Would it make the environment more unstable with our near peers?
Well, sir, I think the goal of everything that we're doing is to try and increase strategic stability, to maintain a strong enough deterrent force to keep our adversaries guessing and uncertain about their capabilities. So everything that we do is with that objective in mind. There's nothing that we do to try to create a more unstable security environment.
Does having such a submarine-based capability put our submarines under an unacceptable risk of detection and so forth?
I'll yield over to Admiral Gilday on that in terms of the actual operational elements of the attack submarine force.
Sir, I think anytime you fire a weapon, you face that kind of risk in terms of, particularly if you're firing from a concealed position like a submarine. But it's not just what you're firing, it's how you're going to actually maneuver to conduct the fight, right? So it's how we're going to fight, our concepts of operations. And so that'll be taken into account, and each situation where we employ those weapons will be a little bit different. So it'll be based on the fighting environment as well.
So are you confident that even if there is a risk, it would be an acceptable risk?
Sir, we would maneuver to make that risk accessible.
Okay.
We want to create a dilemma for the Chinese fleet commanders so that they don't know what vectors they have to protect themselves from.
Okay, thank you. And how would not having this capability affect your ability to operate in a contested environment with a near-peer competitor?
So I think the ability to have a long-range weapon at speed like hypersonics, it allows you to get in closer sooner. So it allows you to create a dilemma for the enemy where you actually outstick them with mass volumes of fire to put yourself in a position of advantage early.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate those answers. Changing gears, I'd like to ask you about the 4 public shipyards. And I know that the current budget includes funding to continue the virtual mapping of the public shipyards and some military construction funding for dry docks. When do you expect that the Navy will complete this mapping and begin increasing annual investments in the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Plan, SIOP, in line with about $1 billion annually that it's going to need?
Just at a high level, sir, this is about a 20-year program that we have that we absolutely must do with these public shipyards to modernize them, not just modernize the facilities, but modernize the way in which work flows through them more efficiently and more effectively. So we are starting already on this process of investing in this long-term plan. And I don't know if CNO has any more to say about that.
Yeah, so the mapping should take a couple of years in terms of doing the virtual mapping of all the shipyards and really taking a look at processes and how they can become more efficient. But at the same time, we're investing in infrastructure like dry docks. We just began work less than a month ago down in Norfolk on a dry dock that's 101 years old. We just did a ribbon cutting up at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on a deep basin up there. And so at the same time, sir, we're taking a look at where we want to make deliberate investments. We know some things now that we have to fix. We have to replace cranes. We have to rebuild dry docks as examples.
Okay, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I've had a chance to meet with you all over the last few months or so, and again, just really impressive, serious people, and appreciate your testimony here today. Just real quick on the 30-year shipbuilding plan issue and the integrated force structure assessment. The reason why that's in statute on the 30-year is just that the shipbuilding takes a long time. A sub is about 65 months for Virginia class. Columbia will be longer. Carriers, I think it's year 12 for the Ford carrier. So we need to have that longer sort of perspective, because these investment decisions, again, just have they're just years-long impact in terms of how Congress operates. The integrated force structure assessment, again, we look forward to seeing it, but I mean, without trying to quibble here, these are two separate endeavors. I mean, the 30-year shipbuilding plan is a budget requirement in law, and the integrated force structure assessment, just like the last one in 2016, I mean, that was a separate process, a good process. And so, and the reason isn't necessarily to find out what's the top line, how many do we need? It's also about the fleet architecture. What's the composition of the fleet? Because when we talk about lethality, it matters, in terms of being able to see, where we're going over just a one-year budget period. So, for example, in this year's submission, you've got 2 salvage ships. We need them, they're important, but let's face it, the O plans for our near-peer competitors, China and Russia, attack submarines are really the tip of the spear in terms of, what we need out there. And cutting, that Virginia-class sub, I mean, again, I just think is at odds with the national defense strategy when you sort of drill down in terms of what real lethality is. So last year, Admiral Richardson, Mr. Admiral Gilday's predecessor, when he was testifying about boosting attack sub production to above the program of record of 2 a year, stated that with respect to our greatest gap between the warfighting requirement and current inventory, there is no greater need than the attack submarine fleet. It's a wide gap, and it's getting wider. So every single submarine counts against closing that gap. Again, at that point, we were talking about going above the program of record. Now we're in a situation where we're below the program of record of two a year. Again, I want to just salute the fact that in your unfunded priorities, you put at the top of the list restoring that submarine. Again, Admiral Gilday, we were up in Groton on Monday, and a couple months ago up in Quonset. You got a real firsthand look in terms of the workforce, the design completion, which you mentioned for the VPM and Columbia. What's the Navy's position about execution in terms of adhering to the 2 a year program? And in terms of just, is that a factor in the decision, or was it resources?
So it was definitely affordability in terms of that submarine being cut. If I could make a point about the force structure assessment, and so that work is done. And I think the reason you would benefit from having that inform the 30-year shipbuilding plan is because if we didn't use it to inform this plan, you'd go back to the 2016 assessment. And as you said yesterday, that 30-year shipbuilding plan is the headlights that we provide so that you know where we need to go. So I think if we can have those discussions with the Secretary of Defense, and once he's comfortable with that, I think that is all packaged and ready to come up to the Hill.
Yeah, Mr. Courtney, if you don't mind me commenting on this as well.
Because I have one more quick question. Yeah.
Just quickly about 30-year shipbuilding plan. We agree with you. We understand the congressional requirement. It's a requirement for the Secretary of Defense to deliver. He wants a little bit more time to understand it, and we're going to help him with that. And it's not going to be a long delay. It will, as you think about this 21 budget, you'll have plenty of information and enough time to be able to do that.
Okay, the chairman's plan is to get this to the floor, as you know, on a very aggressive schedule this year, which I support. Regarding Columbia, we talked again up in Groton about the fact that the NSPDF, which at least created authorities for incremental funding and multi-year, is a way of reducing costs. And if there's, maybe you could just comment in terms of whether the Navy's coming to us with more requests in that regard.
Yes, sir. So to your previous question, you asked about numbers per year. Yes, in terms of 2 a year. To close the gap of where we need to be, that's how we need to build. And if you ask me, if I could give you another ship today, what would it be? It would be a Virginia-class submarine. And your question was about the
incremental authorities. Yeah, maybe we want to take that for the record because I don't want to.
It's not the fund; it's the funding. That's the issue, is the funding that needs to go in that bin. I personally don't care what bin it's in as long as we can use it to build more submarines. But that's the issue, is fencing that money off. The authorities are terrific and help us tremendously.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining us. Secretary Miley, I want to begin with you. You've heard my colleagues talk at length about the underinvestment the Navy's making in shipbuilding. When you put that in contrast to our adversaries and the increased investments that they're making, the pace that they're building their navies, it is pretty concerning. 355 ships is the law, and we look today as the Navy's budget, only about 10% of the Navy's budget is devoted towards building ships. And if you look at the current path that you're on, we're only going to have a net increase of 8 ships in the next 5 years. You talked about getting to 355 by 2030. That is an impossible task based on the current pace. You heard my colleague, Mr. Courtney, talk about the incredible importance of our attack submarines. We're going to be down to 42 submarines, attack submarines, by 2028. All of those things lead me to this question. What is the Navy going to do in looking at reallocating resources to the shipbuilding account over the period in the near future through the 5-year defense plan, better known as the fit-up? Give me your perspective on how we do that, because you talked about 2030 being the focus on getting to 255. Tell me what you're going to do immediately to get us on that path.
Well, sir, thanks very much for that question. As you know, I've been pretty vocal supporter of the 355 ship Navy since I've been back in the Department of the Navy. And I would just take issue with your point about it being impossible. I don't think it's impossible. I think there are two things that have to happen for it to be possible. One is a reasonable plan that demonstrates how we can get there on an accelerated path, and political will.
Yeah.
That's it. Those two things to come together, then I think we can do it. My job is to develop that plan in a reasonable way, and also demonstrate that the answer isn't, oh, we need more top line to do this. Because I know that in our $207 billion a year budget, there's a lot of money in there that we could probably use a lot more efficiently. So I chartered about 2 weeks ago something called a stem to stern review, and we're looking internally to see what we can stop doing that doesn't make sense for this future force. And that's what we're doing. So we're going to go through this process. I gave them I was very aggressive on the timeline. I said 45 days, we need some answers on this. What we need to get on this path from preliminary analysis that we've done is about $5 to $8 billion more a year. Relative to the overall DoD budget, it's a very, very small amount. But I'm not in the business of making trades on the overall DoD budget. I'm just in the business of trying to present a plan, advocate for the Navy for the reasons that are important for the nation, and sell that plan as something that's reasonable that can be done, and then the political will has to align around it, and then we can go do it.
Gotcha. Well, listen, thank you so much for being focused on getting us to 355. Thanks for saying it's not impossible. I put that out there just to get your thoughts on what the path may be going forward. I'm glad to hear from you that it is possible and that we are going to get on the path to do that. Admiral Gilday, I want to go to some of the comments that you've made. You talked about not just the ship component of the Navy, but the manning component of the Navy. And we see some of the things that have happened because of manning issues, the risk that the Navy has taken on, in many instances, unacceptable risk. And you talked about the shortfall of sailors being at about 6,000. It now looks like some of the new projections are closer to maybe 9,000 sailors. Can you give me your perspective on what the Navy can do to reverse this alarming trend? And what are we going to do to make sure as ships go to sea, we have both proper manning and training to make sure that our sailors have exactly what they need to do the difficult job we ask of them?
So, sir, thanks. So the answer is retaining them, right? Retaining that talent. And so that begins with their families and all of those programs that we have, including childcare, including housing, and the focus in our budget reflects it that we're putting on that. Right now, our retention numbers over the past year are at 75%. So we've exceeded at every pay grade our expectations in terms of the numbers we retain. A lot of that has to do with the good work that the Navy's done over the past few years to digitize many of the applications that we use for sailors. So to give you an example, we have a detailing marketplace now where on an app, they can compete for jobs, and they can do this a year out so that their family has the understanding of where they're going to move next. It allows the family to actually, through these apps, take care of child care and housing reservations months out before they even report to the duty station. They seem like small things, but we're taking systems that are maybe 75 different websites, and we're collapsing it down to a single entry point through a microprocessing app on your phone that just makes a world of difference for people. So it's really, sir, a long answer to your question, it's really putting a focus on people and families.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to really deal with the fundamental thing that's going on here. It's a sea change. The 355 ship Navy is yesterday's plan. If I'm at all perceptive of what's going on here, is that the Navy is rethinking the way it will operate and the equipment, ships, and other things that they need to operate, and that's underway. The Marine Corps, you're very clear that you're in the process of doing that. I sense, well, myself, that this is happening, and therefore a frustration about, let's share about what you're thinking. This may not be the forum in which that takes place, but underlying all of the questions that have come thus far, and my own, is, wait a minute, everything that we've been building and planning for, and suddenly, wait a minute, the sea change is occurring and you're rethinking this. Good. To the extent that you can, share with us soon the general outline of that rethinking. Commandant Berger, you said that you're not able, given today's budget, to make that shift today. I understand that. Nevertheless, we need to change our thinking. And we need to put in place in this NDAA and the appropriations the elements that allow you to continue that process. Right now, we're very much in the dark. We really don't have that. And therefore, we're we're clearly, I'm frustrated. I think my colleagues are also. The information we're hearing doesn't line up, or the information we're giving doesn't line up to what you're saying, or at least indicating. So, having said that, in 2.5 minutes, let me get to one of my favorite subjects, which I think all of you are aware of, and it's sea lift capacity. My new flag that I keep waving in front of you folks. Whatever that future holds, the current sea lift capacity, which is inadequate for at least the next decade, we need to think about how to bring into reality a sea lift capacity for whatever you plan out there. Big power competition. The Pacific is a long, big ocean, and we simply are not capable of sustaining the fight. I mean, it's very clear. I want to work with you on developing a national fleet. The bow wave of the Columbia and rockets and nuclear and other things is going to make it very, very difficult to provide the logistical sea lift support from the Navy budget. You were just talking about that. Is there another way to do it? I think there is. I think if we are to rebuild our merchant marine capacity in a way that builds that capacity in a militarily useful, Navy useful manner for both the transport of weapons, material, men, equipment, as well as fuel, I think we can do it without significant impact on the Navy budget. And the Navy budget, insofar as non-combat ships, would be for the specialty ships that are not now available, but would absolutely be necessary. So the Navy does that, and then the merchant marines over here. We have available to us programs that have not been used for a couple of decades. So I want to just put that on the table, pursue that with you, and obviously we don't have 38 seconds to answer all the questions here, but be aware we're going to have this with MARAD, Admiral Busby and the like, and so I'll let it go at that. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your support, and thank you as well for your support as well, Mrs. Gilley. You've mentioned several times about the improvements with the F-18s and their readiness levels, and we too celebrate that. This has been a focus of this committee for several years to get that up, and so we celebrate the 80% readiness milestone. I really think that we continue to build on that with this year's budget that you put forth, additional 24 new mission-capable aircraft. And as you know, the new aircraft have the most immediate and profound impact on the tactical aviation inventory and fleet readiness, which is why I am concerned that the budget request proposes to eliminate 36 Super Hornets for future year defense budget. So would you please speak to how this will impact the tactical aviation inventory, since that's 3 squadrons worth of aircraft that the Navy is no longer investing in? And it's my understanding the Navy has an existing strike fighter shortfall of approximately 48 aircraft. So could you please speak to the impact and the potential operational risk that this will bring to our readiness?
Ma'am, thanks for the question. The cuts this year were due to affordability, and so we made what we thought were balanced risk discussions based on what we could afford given the current top line. The mission-capable jets, the path that we're on right now to get the most we can out of the fleet that we have, including modernizing our existing Super Hornets to Block 3s, puts us on a good path. As you know, the numbers of our F-18 Super Hornets are above 650. The fleet that we really need when we have our 4th and 5th gen mix is around 785. And so we're trying to maintain that path through the FYDP and beyond.
Will you be able to maintain the 80% target for mission-capable aircraft by cutting these aircraft out?
Yeah, we think we will. So the fact that we've reduced the buy doesn't necessarily affect our ability to reach 80% mission capability.
Okay.
Mission-capable aircraft, excuse me.
I'm still concerned about this decision and the cost that it could bring to the aircraft, because you have current production lines that help bring the parts and the service to the modernization effort. And if you cut out that new line, then that could jeopardize the ability to get your parts and for the modernization. So could you please elaborate on whether the Navy has assessed what if additional cost will be incurred should the Super Hornet production line be shuttered? And can you provide this cost analysis to the committee?
Ma'am, if we could, I'd like to get back to you with some more detailed information on that so that we can lay it all out for you in a way that makes sense and gets to the details that you're asking for.
And you said that the cuts were due to the lower top line. Are you saying that if we were to add additional funds, you would support reinstating those new aircraft and pushing that out?
I think it would go into the prioritization mix as we took a look at what we really need, based on the time frame that we're given.
Okay, very good. Switching gears, talking about munitions, certainly we have a lot of challenges with that. Our stockpiles of high demand preferred precision-guided munitions have been significantly reduced, as we all know, over the last 15 years. So in order to meet the objectives of the National Defense Strategy to support globally and integrated defense planning for contingencies, we need to procure sufficient inventories of munitions by a healthy industrial base. So what is your assessment of risk in the Navy's precision-guided and preferred munitions request, and what specific actions are you taking to manage stability, capability, and capacity risk in the U.S. munitions industrial base, to include reducing critical supply chain dependencies sourced from outside the United States?
Ma'am, in terms of our budget this year, and I talked about a focus on both readiness and lethality, and 21% of our budget dedicated to that. So a large portion of that is dedicated not only on modernizing our ships and aircraft, but filling our magazines with weapons. So that's not only our ships, but also our air wings. And to get to your last point in the supply chain, ma'am, I'd have to get back to you on that with more details.
Right. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral Gilday, I understand the P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft are the best submarine hunting aircraft in the world. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you please describe to us and me in an unclassified way how we use our Poseidon aircraft specifically with respect to Russia and China?
So it's the most effective platform that we have for not only wide area search, but also localization, and so that we can actually find, fix, and if we're in a position to finish a Russian submarine. And so the capabilities of those P-8s, I think the best testimony is the fact that all of our allies and partners are lining up to buy the P-8. Tremendous capability.
So knowing that, were you surprised to see the department see in one of the cuts a P-8 cut from last year's budget to help for this border wall?
Yes, sir. Before my time, I can't speak to that, to the decisions that were made in the last budget.
Okay. Acting Secretary Modley, the recent reprogramming notice says that the items above last year's budget requests were what was stolen from, but the Navy says that we need 138 P-8As and we only have funding for 120. How is the reprogramming anything other than arbitrary and capricious if the Navy is disagreeing with the department's rationale for completing this theft of its budget?
Well, sir, those decisions are made by the Secretary of Defense. We support them as he makes them, but he has lots of trade-offs that he has to make for other competing priorities. We would obviously love to have more P-8s, clearly. It's an incredible weapons platform. We want a lot of our allies to have them too. So we are looking for ways to work with our allies to get them involved in the program so that Boeing can continue to produce them out in Washington.
Were any of you consulted before being informed that your budget was being cut by Secretary Esper and others in the administration? Did they talk to you? Did they ask your preferences if this was, necessary or not necessary?
Well, sir, we go through a continual process on budget negotiations and deliberations. So we're consulted all along the way. Ultimately, we don't have a veto.
Well, no, and I understand that. I definitely understand you guys don't have a veto, but more along the lines of, did Secretary Esper or other aspects of the administration at least talk to y'all before they went and did this cut? Because this is not just unfunded money like it was last year. This is actual equipment, very necessary equipment.
We knew that they were looking at a variety of different options, and then at the end, those options were presented to us.
Right. Admiral Gilday, again, understand that you didn't have a veto over any of this.
Sir, I was not consulted before that final decision was made in the $3.8 million under the provision 284.
Okay. Assuming the same thing, General Berger?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. So moving on. Our national posture in Asia is mostly naval and highly concentrated in varying small and specific parts of Japan and Korea. This committee recently heard testimony from former East Asia DAST Abraham Denmark that the relatively small number of large bases that we have in Asia should be diversified to a new approach that prioritizes new airfields, new people positioning, and new posture. What is your take on the survivability of our naval assets in Asia and the supply lines across the Pacific should the balloon go up? We'll start with you, Admiral Gilday.
So I think based on the fact that where we're located, we have concerns, which is why we're making investments in better weapon systems. And it's not just on the kinetic side, it's the investments that the department's making in space and in cyberspace to put us in a much better position against those types of threats.
And just because I have want to get one more question in, how does this budget take the necessary steps to increase the survivability of our Indo-Pak Comm assets against Chinese threats or aggression? Mr. Botley.
Well, as I mentioned before, everything that we did was to increase the readiness and lethality of our forces that are, particularly the ones that are deployed. And so that's really what our primary concern is right now. So as we look to the future, we're looking at some of these other bigger issues in terms of how do we distribute our force, how do we do more distributed maritime operations, what types of ships will we need to do that, to support that, et cetera. And those are the types of changes and things that you will see that will be different in this force structure assessment than the one that was done 4 years ago.
Great. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly. Sorry, Mr. Kelly. Sorry to... Hello. Mr. Kelly. Oh,
thank you.
Look here. Sorry.
Thanks, Mr. Mitchell. I first want to talk about, I want to be real clear. I support our border and particularly our southern border and building the wall. However, during the recent reprogram, $650 million was diverted from an LHA American class of amphibious ship, which is built by Huntington Ingalls, a massive shipbuilder in Mississippi. The impact that will be felt will be loss of jobs, and it will hurt the industrial shipbuilding base. I think consistency, long-term maintained plans are key to maintaining our industrial base, and they, much like an aircraft carrier, can't turn on a dime. And so when we destroy that industrial base, we don't just get it back when we decide we want to build a different ship. So what is the plan to get this ship back on track, either Mr. Secretary or Admiral Gilday?
So I can speak to the high level on that. We did end up, the funding was moved from this year for that. However, it did not change the delivery time for that ship. We actually pulled that ship forward and plan on starting that in FY23. In previous plans, it was either 24 or 25. So it's actually, over the course of the last couple of years, we've actually accelerated the delivery of that ship. And we understand and we're very sympathetic to the impact it might have on employment down there in Mississippi. That is a critical shipyard for us, so they do fantastic work, and we want to make sure that we maintain a healthy shipbuilding capacity down there. But this was just a decision that was made here at the end game.
Understand, but what we do is lose long-term effects for short-term gains. And you can't buy that back. We see that when we make cuts in personnel to the Marine Corps or the Navy or the Army. When we make those cuts, and then the next year we go, well, that number was a little too low, so we'll just build it back. You can't replace that E6 with a trainee. That's 12 years of experience to get there that we can't replace. It's the same way with the industrial base. If they're geared up and tooled up to build a ship, and we change the plans, they can't just next year when we change them back, get back to the same spot because they've lost that. Those guys are working somewhere else. Those guys and girls are doing a different job somewhere else, and we can't rebuild it. We just have to be real careful about doing that. And I'm a firm believer in all of our services owe us. Every year we ask you, what are your personnel numbers? What are your requirements? And when you give those to us and then we change them the next year, it makes it very difficult for us to plan and our industrial base to plan. And we've got to adhere to that because I'm a kind of a patent guy. An 80% plan violently executed is better than a 100% plan 2 days after it mattered. And so I just ask that we keep that in mind when we're dealing with the industrial base. General Berger, in your planning guidance, you talk about the need for smaller, more maneuverable Marine Corps that gets back to expeditionary routes. It suggests we may need different platforms or amphibious ships to do this. Can you tell me what you envision in this, General Berger?
So for the last 2 decades, we did what the nation needed us to do in the Middle East, but that's not what you need us to do in the future. You need us as part of an integrated naval force because our view, that's an asymmetric advantage that we have by a wide margin. We need to sustain that margin. So in simple terms, we need, instead of a land force that could sometimes, if we really tried and it would be really painful, get aboard ship, we need to be a naval force that you can send where you need to, the commander can send where they need to, can go ashore when they choose to, back aboard ship, very dispersed, very distributed. In other words, pose an adversary a real challenge that it makes his day really hard. That's what we got to do.
Thank you, and I agree, and I think that 98-year-old Marine would agree also. He's not here anymore, Commandant, but I think he would definitely agree. And Secretary Modly, I want to talk a little bit. I just visited a DDG when I was in Rhoda and visited our great sailors out there, and we had a discussion yesterday. But I just want you to talk about your optimized fleet response plan and how personnel figures into that.
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do, particularly in this budget, is adjust some of the problems we had in previous years with respect to the manning that we had on our ships. And I think that the CNO mentioned this earlier in terms of what he experienced back when he was on a DDG and what that had declined to over the years. And we started seeing the results of that in these horrible accidents that we had in the Pacific a couple years ago. So we're trying to adjust that to make that better. With respect to specifically about RP, we are doing a deep dive look on that. The Secretary of Defense actually hired an outside company, FFRDC, to help us look at that and look at better options for that. I would...
Hey, I apologize, gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here today. Secretary Modley, in your opening statement, you indicated that you are committed to stamping out sexual harassment in the Navy. And yet last February, you promoted a man named Ronnie Booth to head the Navy's audit agency, even though there had been multiple whistleblowers and complainants that had come forward documenting his workplace sexual harassment retaliation dating back to 2007. Alarmingly, many people reported him wanting to offer to mentor female subordinates, suggested they meet outside of work, arrange travel with them. This man is the person you chose to lead a major naval agency. I wrote your office asking about these concerns, and then Secretary Spencer responded by saying there was no documented, substantiated evidence of Mr. Booth's behavior. Yet, following my letter, Mr. Booth was reassigned to work as a special assistant and retired shortly thereafter. Would you please indicate to us how that squares?
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate the question, and I remember your letter very clearly. Let me say that that situation was part of a broader cultural and climate problem that I had at the Naval Audit Service. I had to take action to remove somebody and move somebody into a position of authority in that organization. I did it very methodically and very carefully. There, if I may.
Well,
I was not aware, when we made that decision, we went back and followed all the rules in terms of what can restrict you from putting somebody in a position of that place. There was no documented evidence, no IG investigations, nothing.
There were complaints that had been filed. How can you say there was no documented evidence?
There was no documented evidence in his individual record that prohibited me from doing that. When I found out about this, thanks to your letter and to some emails that came to me, we immediately started an internal investigation. The DOD started an internal, broader investigation, and we were told to shut down our investigation on that.
Who told you to shut it down?
The DOD IG. Because once they started an investigation, we can't have a parallel investigation.
I see, because they were now investigating.
That's
I guess
correct.
the real question is, why did it take a letter from me that then triggered an Inspector General evaluation?
Because there was no evidence before I found that.
Well, I find it hard to believe if there are complaints that are filed that that's not considered evidence. Let me ask you another question.
Well, may I say something else about this?
No, well,
if
maybe
the
for the record.
suggestion is that I would
for
ever
the record.
that I would ever
for
put
the
in,
record.
Ms. Modley, she controls the time. I'm sympathetic because she has the right to ask the questions she wants to ask, so let her ask.
In the budget proposal, the Navy has cut the SAPRO budget. How can you cut that budget when we have an epidemic on our hands?
Ma'am, I don't know the specifics in terms of how much we cut that budget, but I have been extremely committed to fighting sexual assault and harassment in the service.
Then why do you cut the budget? The
I don't know
numbers are up.
The numbers are up. We take it very seriously. The Navy, the Department of the Navy, actually initiated actions with other universities around the country to get after this problem, to share information and to share data. And I will just say, if the suggestion is that I would ever put a person in a position of authority knowing full well with documented evidence that that person was a sexual harasser, that would never happen.
Well,
I would never do that. And
all
the
right.
suggestion, I think,
this is my time. I'd like to ask another question. The LCS turned out to be a debacle. Part of the problem was the cost estimates were way undervalued. They were first supposed to be $220 million apiece. They ended up costing 2.5 times that much. The GAO said you should do independent cost estimates. As of August of 2019, there has never been an independent estimate of the frigate. CBO thinks that the actual cost will probably exceed your estimates by about $300 million per ship. Seems like we need the benefit of an independent estimate. Are you intending to do that?
We intend to do, the LCS program predates me by many, many years. We intend to do independent cost estimates on every new platform that we're doing.
So the frigate will be subject to an independent cost estimate?
Yes.
All right, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to go off in a different direction. We had the NATO parliamentary meeting this last week, and there were kind of some things that were said there that were kind of scary to me, because some of the concerns in this committee were our ability, the number of ships to, if the balloon went up in Europe, our air refueling capability, which was a very contentious hearing here. Boeing did not have a good day, and I won't go into that. But the point that was made at this meeting here, and I'm a big NATO supporter and everything like that, it broke out that the EU was invited to speak. And they're talking, quite frankly, about taking over some of the aspects, the way I understood it, of the strategic forces under their cognizance. Now, we've had problems with the EU going from some of the different exercises, and the RAND study that a few years ago the Javelin missile and some of the other systems were based on some of these things. Now, if this is true, and it might be partly a reaction to Brexit, but there were a lot of countries that were alarmed at the fact that now the EU is going to make it very, very difficult if there are many of these countries, which are NATO members but also EU members, are not totally committed to NATO. Do you have any reactions, Mr. Secretary, at all, or have you heard any of the repercussions of that conference?
I have not been briefed on any of the repercussions of that conference and on these discussions, so I don't have a comment right now. I can find out more information on it and get back to you, sir.
Yeah, and the reason I raised this issue here, because we're talking about some of these funding issues. In the past, it was a situation in Korea, and it changes from day to day where the threat is. And by the way, I want to thank you for coming here. We learn a lot. I think we make changes. I remember when General Scaparrotti talked about the Air Force wanted to get rid of the U-2s. This was in Korea, and he said no. The U-2s had more reliability. Next thing you know, they're back in the budget. So some of the things that you say here have tremendous repercussions, at least in my decision-making, and I think everyone here. All I'm saying is that some of these other questions in terms of preparing, pre-positioning equipment and everything else, if this NATO situation is going to be revisited in terms of perhaps conflicts with the EU, I think it might affect some of the things, our budget decisions in this committee. The Admiral or General, do you have any comments on that? I think you're familiar with those.
So I just say I take your point. There are two different political bodies that make different decisions that are not always synchronized, and there's a potential risk, I think your point is, to NATO. I just am not familiar with the context of last week's discussions in Brussels.
Yeah, it was on class, and you can probably see everything. General Berger, I never thought I'd be happy about the day that we're not getting a new weapon systems or anything else, but right now in the president's budget, we have the sewer plant for 29 Palms. This combat Marine, that's his greatest accomplishment, was to get the sewer plant for 29 Palms. But it really, really is a big deal because of the environmental concerns in California. And something like that can, I think it's one of the greatest training bases in the world. And it's an admin thing, so I'm going to try and bring that all the way to fruition. So thank you very much for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony here today. I'm really proud of the efforts in the Department of Defense, our uniformed services, in integrating a force and leading this nation by example. Starting in the 1940s, executive orders that removed racial barriers to service, the work that has happened over the years for inclusion of women in now every aspect of the military. It's hard to believe that it took an act of Congress just last year to finally get the Marine Corps to include women in basic training platoons. But you know, sometimes it's come easy, and sometimes it's been a little bit more of a challenge. But I think we can all take pride in the progress that we've made. Mr. Secretary, I really, really want to thank you for the historic decision that you made in naming an aircraft carrier after an enlisted soldier, recognizing the important contributions that enlisted men and women make to the force, and to naming that aircraft carrier after Cook First Class Doris Miller. So thank you very much for that. Having said what I've just said, we've got a problem. We've got a problem in both the civilian staffing and in uniform staffing in both the Navy and the Marines, and particularly in what I call the elite sectors, such as your fighter squadrons. Looking at your civilian staffing, you stated in your statement on page 17 regarding recruiting, curating, and retaining the best talent that you're leveraging leading private sector business practices. But in your human capital strategy for 2019 to 2030, there's only one mention of diversity in that strategy. Mr. Secretary, what are you doing to ensure that you are diversifying the civilian workforce at the Department of Navy?
Mr. Brown, thanks. First of all, thank you for the compliment on the Doris Miller. I really appreciate that, and agree with you in terms of the historical significance of it. And I will tell you that as great a day as it was for the family of Doris Miller, it was an even greater day for the Navy. So just a wonderful moment for us as a country. We have challenges with this, or we've talked about this in your office before, about the challenges we have, particularly on the uniform side. As people progress through the service, we don't have a lot of diversity in the senior ranks. We have pretty good diversity in the civilian ranks. It's interesting that you noted that. I did not note that when I read through the human capital strategy. I'll have to look through that again. But the whole concept of our human capital strategy is to try to attract people from a variety of different areas, new types of people, new thinking, more diverse thinking, give them ways to come in and serve in the government, perhaps go back out. So I will look in specifically.
Yeah, so let me just suggest then, if in your statement, you suggest that you're taking leading private sector business practices, I think in this regard, the private sector is well out in front of your strategy. So I would ask you to go back and look. Let's turn to the uniform service. Both the Marine Corps and the Navy, you have a serious problem in your fighter units, your fighter pilots. You have in the Navy 710 Navy fighter pilots, 17 or less than 3% are African American and not a single woman. You have 735 Marine Corps fighter pilots, less than 1% or five are African American, one woman. You've got claims of equal opportunity violations, inspector general reports. You have flag officers who are making inappropriate public comments, undermining the integrity of the EO process and the inspector general process. And I've sent a letter to the secretary to that regard. You have pilots, an African American pilot who has left the service, another whose record is still tarnished and will inhibit his promotion, a whistleblower who is still on the edge waiting an outcome of a report. And the concern is that the initial EO complaints substantiated that there were racial discrimination against these pilots. And then for some unexplained reason, it was reversed. And now you have 3 people sitting on pins and needles, wondering the fate of their future because you have these outstanding complaints. So you take the numbers alone, the lack of diversity and conclusion by race and gender, you've got these terrible cases in front of you, and you have a pilot shortage to boot. You've got a lot of work to do. So I'll take it for the record what your response will be, because I did submit a letter to you back in January, and I'm waiting for the response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Secretary Moodley, so in the last 24 hours, we've learned that you have delivered the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment to the Secretary of Defense. He wants some time to evaluate that, potentially compare it against some alternative assessments that are out there, whether they're in CAPE or he alluded to outside assessments, and that is why we don't have the 30-year shipbuilding plan, because it would be informed by the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment. But over the last 4 years, we've done a lot of outside studies. A lot of us have committed to, not only rhetorically, but put it into law that we need a 355-ship fleet. We believe that to be a floor, not a ceiling. So could you help us put into perspective what the total ownership costs of a 355-ship Navy would be in constant dollars over the current fleet of about 293 ships?
So as we've looked at this in terms of, as we use the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment as our benchmark, as sort of our North Star in terms of where we think we should go as the Department of the Navy, and understand that the Secretary of Defense has not signed off on that or has not bought into it yet. In order to get there on an accelerated path, which would approximate getting to that ideal force structure in 10 years, it's probably, if you assume a flatline budget for us, it's probably going to take between $120 and $130 billion more total over that 10 years. Those are the initial cuts we're looking at, initial numbers that we're looking at. So that's basically what it comes down to.
So per year, it would be fair to say that would be well north of $8 billion.
Yeah, we're looking, and that's the reason why I put this benchmark out for our teams to look at how do we get $8 billion out of the top line that we have right now, so at least we can start moving down that path.
Thank you. Admiral Gilday, I couldn't help but notice that the budget for the new frigate now reflects 1 ship per year over the first 3 years of production. Can you assure me that the Navy remains fully committed to executing this program to achieve the 20 ships briefed to this committee previously?
Yes, sir. We're committed to that number. I think that 1 frigate in the first year is prudent. We need to get this right. There have been comments made about LCS and other programs, and so we're focused on making sure that that first ship puts us in a very good direction for the remainder of the class.
Secretary Modly, should the Columbia be a Navy bill?
Well, Rep. Gallagher, it is a Navy bill, and so we're assuming that it is a Navy bill. Obviously, it has strategic implications for the whole country, for the whole force, but right now it is a Navy bill.
Commandant Berger, in your planning guidance, you write about the importance of ground-based, long-range precision fires with no less than 350 nautical mile ranges, and you call for potentially we need more than that. Can you talk a bit about how central these long-range precision fires are to your planning guidance and executing the overall strategy, and what any restrictions on the ranges of missiles your Marines could employ would impact your ability to execute your vision?
The distributed maritime operations concept that we fit within means we do 2 things in support of the fleet commander: sea control and sea denial. The fires that you're speaking of, that capability allows us to do that, either embarked or ashore. Well, what's the value? The value to the fleet commander is he's not just hauling them around Marines as passengers anymore. They are part of his fighting capability. We need the ability to reach out and hold at risk an adversary's naval fleet from wherever we are, embarked or ashore. Range limitations, you definitely want longer rather than shorter if you're going to outstick an opponent. So any restrictions on ranges of weapon systems, from our perspective, from a warfighting perspective, we're gonna push back on that. Then it becomes just a function of technology and weight, size. We have to be mobile. We have to be expeditionary.
Let me just follow on your planning guidance. Well, this is just a comment. Your planning guidance has sparked a lot of very useful discussion in forums like War on the Rocks among company-grade officers, field-grade officers. I know you're bought into this, but I just would please continue to encourage that. Make sure that those Marines who are challenging long-held assumptions aren't being punished when it comes time for them to be up for promotion, because I think this is a really healthy discussion going on in the Navy and the Marine Corps right now among all levels of officers and enlisted, and I'm really pleased to see that. Finally, just to end where we started, I've had a really, at times, contentious debate about waiting for the shipbuilding plan, and, there's a lot of frustration here. In 2017, we had 3 outside studies about the force structure and where we needed to go with the fleet. The next year, the NDS came out. 2 months later, in March 2018, the Navy came to this committee and testified that a new FSA was on its way. Then in September, the Navy said, wait, it's not coming until 2019. N9 said we'd have it by now last year. So please, just as soon as you can, tell us your vision for the future of the Navy and the Marine Corps in geopolitical terms. I think you will find a very receptive audience here, because it's hard for us to give you money until we know that vision.
Duly noted. Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start by echoing my colleague and fellow Marine Mike Gallagher's comments about how important it is to encourage this discussion. And I would say not only should we make sure that these Marines aren't punished for being willing to question assumptions, they're exactly the people that we should be promoting, and promoting quickly. What you're doing is setting an important tone for the entire Department of Defense, Commandant. And we need the other services to do it too. We need to do it more. I'm the co-chairman with Representative Jim Banks, a Navy veteran of the Future Defense Task Force. We're trying to do that here on the Armed Services Committee to really question our assumptions. Because we are losing the game to Russia and China right now. That's the harsh reality. They are outpacing us, and that's why they're closing the gap. So we've got to keep doing this, and it's incredibly important. Of course, one of the challenges is literally staring at you on this committee, because about half the questions this morning, if my tally is correct, were essentially parochial questions about district priorities, not strategic questions about what we need for our Navy or Marine Corps. In other words, are my airplanes going to be okay at my local base, or my missile capability, is that going to be developed? How do you propose that we get around that challenge to your changes, and that we support your courageous willingness to slay sacred cows in order to make room for new and innovative weapon systems?
I think we owe you a couple things, sir. First of all, our assumptions about where the threat is, where the adversary will be in the future, which could change, because there's a series of assumptions that go into that. Second is a clear picture at the unclass, more valuable, the classified level of how we expect we will fight the joint force. Then a subset of that is how we will fight the naval force. Armed with that, you should be able to ask us, okay, now armed with that, the threat picture is this. I understand now how you think you're going to fight. Tell me how these capabilities that you're asking for, that you're on your shopping list, how do they fit into that mix?
So let me ask you, Commandant, about one specific capability, the CH-53. As you're aware, the Marine Corps has a proud tradition of generating overwhelming combat power with less manpower and less cost, but right now the per aircraft cost is set to exceed $120 million, which is $20 million more than a fifth-generation fighter, and many more orders of magnitude, rather, more expensive than proven alternatives such as the CH-47F. That is a very expensive toilet for a joke that only the Marines will get. What's going on here, and what do we need to do to fix it?
The lift requirement to move Marines and equipment and the naval force around remains valid. As distributed as we're going to be, we're going to need the ability to move that force and the sustainment around. So the requirement is valid, and it is 200 aircraft. The cost, to your point, the cost is the big factor. APUC right now, $107 million. Total flyaway costs, we're still a margin away from where it's an affordable aircraft, even to buy off the shelf, much less sustain over the long term. So we have a valid warfighting requirement. We have an affordability challenge. Now it's up to us negotiating with Sikorsky and Lockheed Martin to try to drive the cost down to where it's affordable by the department, affordable by the Marine Corps.
Okay, well, we will certainly support that. Mr. Secretary, I want to come back to a question that Representative Lamborn asked about whether hypersonics increase or decrease strategic stability. And you replied that we always want to increase strategic stability, which I heartily agree with, but it's sort of like acknowledging that the ocean has water in it, which you don't need to be the Secretary of the Navy to know. Explain to me how having a weapon, and understand, I'm supportive of innovative, future-focused capabilities, but how is having a weapon, especially one that is submarine launched, that you know is launched, but you don't know where it's going, and you don't know if it has a conventional or nuclear weapon on it. So in other words, you have to make a decision on how to respond to it in a timeline similar to with an ICBM, except it's more compressed because you don't know where it's going. How does that increase strategic stability?
You need to explain that in 20 seconds, so go.
I'm sorry you didn't like my previous answer, but I think what it does is it creates more unpredictability. that's true. It does, and that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a more unpredictable nature of our forces so that our
Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up, but if we could take this for the record, I think that would be valuable, because I agree, it increases in unpredictability. My concern is that it also increases strategic instability, and we need to understand that more fully before we commit the kinds of funds we're talking about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll take note of my colleagues' admonition about parochial questions, and so I'll ask my parochial question in as strategic a way as I possibly can. We're incredibly proud of the cyber warriors that we train up at Corey Station that go to serve the Navy, and so I was just wanting to give you the opportunity to reflect on the nature of the cyber mission and how it fits into this strategic paradigm that we're working on building.
Yeah, so, sir, thanks for the question, and thanks for the comments about those cyber warriors down at Corey. We think they're the best in the world, or among the best in the world. So we are not going to fight in one domain, and so we are leveraging those cyber warriors in terms of our concept of how we're going to fight in the future. We're about to do our largest exercise in a generation this summer. And as part of that exercise, we're going to include a cyber electronic warfare and space cell inside of our fleet commander's headquarters, and we're going to assign tactical offensive cyber teams to the fight. We haven't done that before. And so just two examples of how we're going to try to better integrate those capabilities into what we want to do in the future.
I also wanted to commend the Navy. We've got a lot of naval aviation going on in my community, and the TH-57 is a platform that needs to be retired. Every other day, we're having one of those helicopters come back on a truck because they're having to land them out in a peanut field or soybean field somewhere as a result of an alert. Folks should not have to train on analog and then go to digital, but the Navy has been very innovative in embracing off-the-shelf options, and I think that particularly at Whiting Field, we're going to see a replacement for the TH-57 that will be at lower cost and with greater utility for our naval aviators. My colleague, Mr. Gallagher, had some follow-up questions, so I'll yield him the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Very generous. Just a quick follow-up for Secretary Modly. So you said that it's going to cost about 120 to 130 billion more over the next 10 years to get to 355 ships. Was that correct? And is that just acquisition costs, or is that the total?
No, that's everything. That's
everything. That's total.
Yes, sir.
Ownership costs. Yes, so that's
above our. If you assume a current flatline budget, this would be the incremental cost of getting to there. As you know, sir, we're kind of tapping out at about 305 ships. That's sort of what would be. If that flat line can sustain that 305 ship. If we want to accelerate to 355 within 10 years, based on the analysis that we've done, that's the incremental additional cost to not only acquire, but also to sustain those platforms.
Okay. So in order to build a fleet that's about 20% bigger than the one we have now, it's going to be about, it's just back of the envelope, 7.5% more each year. But that you're saying that's your analysis. That's the total.
Yes, sir. That's
man, train, build, equip, maintain, modernize.
Right. And that has a lot to do with the mix, because we're not filling that gap with 50 aircraft carriers, right? We're looking at some smaller, more distributed types of ships that are less expensive, and that will help fill the gap over that time.
Great, thank you. And we all look forward to the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment when it arrives.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Horn.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to, General Berger, I want to address my questions to you. When we're speaking about the needs and choices that we're going to have to make in terms of cost, especially looking forward in our needs for the next generation of aircraft and fighters. You have spoken repeatedly about the need for a balanced mix of manned and unmanned systems that includes unmanned aerial combat vehicles and low-cost attributable. I'm having aircraft that are disposable that can be used as targets. I can't get that word out today. Aircraft technologies. And when you talked about the stated requirements for the manned F-35s, while that's well known, the and as a matter of record, we haven't heard articulated requirements for the unmanned systems to be paired with the more technologically advanced aircraft because we're clearly not going to use the F-35s for target practice. So my question is, do you intend to pursue a large number of lethal unmanned aerial systems or per your comments in the command's planning guidance and other statements, or do you have another plan? Can you speak to that first?
I don't know today. We don't know today the number or the ratio. What we know is we got to move faster than we have in the past 3 or 4 years. Some use a metaphor or example of like a quarterback, where the manned platform, a ship or a plane, is sort of the quarterback with a whole bunch of unmanned. And the Air Force uses the term unmanned wingman. We need to move fast. Why? We can cover a lot more ground if it's a mix of manned and unmanned. It's also more survivable. We have got to complicate the adversary's collection and targeting problem. We are making it too simple when they're all manned. So it's not in a trying to reduce casualties mode as much as it is try to gain an advantage and maintain that. But our processes don't reward going out on the edge and replacing something with something you have today. But we have got to press the accelerator down. We got to move now. Initially, some hybrid of manned and unmanned, lightly manned. But in the end, it's going to be a hybrid of all of that. And if you're sitting on the other side in an adversary's radar screen, you can't tell the difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And to follow up on that, I think we're in terms of strategic capabilities and cost and the balance. Do you expect to include those needs in the next version of the aviation plan? When can we expect the requirements for that? Because, as you said, we've got to move fast. But what does that look like in terms of needs assessment?
You'll see it in both 22 and 23 budget. We're in the latter phases now of necking down what we're going to procure to put on board a ship, provide the ISR, and maybe multiple payloads off of a ship. The other construct is an unmanned series of vessels that launches an unmanned swarm of aerial vehicles. Why would we not try to do that? We should never put, if we're going to cross a beach, go somewhere, we should send a machine where we can to do the reconnaissance, to take a look before we ever send the first human.
Cost-effective and strategically increasing capabilities. I yield back the balance of my time. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our gentlemen here today for your leadership and taking care of the world's greatest sailors and Marines. Admiral Gilday, first question for you. 3 years ago, we had a serious readiness problem, and the numbers we were using is only 50% of the aircraft in the Navy could fly on any given day. Now we've had 3 years where we restored roughly 60% of the budget from what we had from 2010 cuts. Could you just give us some feedback? How are we doing with the aircraft readiness? Do we have a very noticeable improvement with the last 3 years' budgets?
Very noticeable improvement. So we're at over 80% right now, sustained with Super Hornets in terms of mission-capable aircraft. And I was just down in Norfolk recently at the operations center, where they actually bring together all the maintenance officers from the wings, and they bring them together to get after constraints or getting ready aircraft back on the flight line. And so includes bringing together the folks from DLA, the folks from the Navy Supply System, engineers from NavAir. And so we've really brought the team together, ironed out some process issues that we've had, and significantly increased readiness.
Is there a way that we could quantify, that was the F-18s when you say 80%, I'd like to be able to go back to our constituents and say, 3 years ago, 50% across the board. Today, we're 75%, or whatever it may be, broader than, say, just the F-18. Because I think that was important. Readiness is vital.
So, sir, if I hear you, are you talking by each type model series?
What was the composite number, the 50% or a cumulative number of all the Navy aircraft?
So I was really talking about the focus initially has been Super Hornets.
Okay.
And so we've been at 50, 55% for a decade. Now we're at 80%, above 80% sustained. We're bringing those same processes into the other type model series aircraft to bring them back, to bring them over 80% sustained as well.
Okay. Thank you. I want to go to electronic warfare. It's something I've been involved with for about 3 decades. And we've fallen significantly behind as a department in each of our services. I appreciate the Navy's focus on it even while I was in the service. I think you had your sights on it all along. The Joint Staff has appointed a 2-star now to lead their EW program. The Air Force has a 1-star. They created a panel for funding, so it's a separate funding process. What is the Navy and the Marines or the department doing to raise the bar here for electronic warfare? Because to me, it's a physical domain that we have to control. We can control the ground, the sea, the air, but if we can't talk, can't use the radars, we're in trouble. So I appreciate your feedback.
Sir, 2 years ago, I think it was, General Neller talked with us about the need to move into the information environment, electronic warfare, MISO, cyber, and military deception faster. He traded, intentionally, deliberately traded a 3-star billet from a command and created a 3-star General Lori Reynolds, who oversees that for us. You know, you wish you could go back 2 years and thank him for that, because right now she is incredibly far out in front of the rest of us, telling us where we need to go. And not just in one area, EW, but how do you integrate those domains and make it a warfighting capability? So on our staff, on our headquarters Marine Corps smaller staff, a Lieutenant General, Lori.
Thank you. Admiral or Secretary, however you want to do it.
Well, I think I'll ask the CNO to talk about this as well, sir, but I think one of the things that we're emphasizing at the department level is to ensure that the Navy and Marine Corps are more integrated in this process going forward, as well as how we integrate with the overall joint force. And there's a lot of emphasis being placed on that at the OSD level as well.
So we stood up the Information Warfare Development Command down in Norfolk, and so it brings together cyber, electronic maneuver warfare, and space into a single warfare development center that actually creates tactics and operating procedures for the fleet. We're testing that in a big exercise. We're testing a lot of that in a big exercise this summer and throughout the deployments that we make. We have put together an IW commander on board our carrier strike groups and our amphibious readiness groups. So that again brings together space, cyber, and EW. We're doing it at the fleet command level based on what we learned there. And the Commandant is integrating with his expeditionary advanced basing concept non-kinetic into the fight from the shore.
Do you have a single belly button, if you will, in the Navy that solve things EW?
So we have a 3-star in charge of programs on my staff. We have the 1-star down in Norfolk that at the tactical level is bringing those concepts together.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, and I'd like to yield just a moment to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you often, rightfully, acknowledge the key contributions to not only our committee, but to the country's national security by the members of the staff of this committee. In my experience, working on 26 years, there is no staff member who has exhibited greater professionalism, dedication to the mission, tolerance and patience with members and our inadequacies than Pete Villano. He's about to leave the committee imminently, and so I think it's appropriate to just take a moment to specifically thank and acknowledge his many contributions to this committee and our work over the years, but also to hold him up as a shining example of the tremendous staff that enable us to do what we do. I yield back.
Thank you, and I want to echo those remarks. In particular, I think it's noteworthy that Pete he's worked for both of us, and that is a key part of this committee, which, by the way, is unlike any other committee in Congress. We are bipartisan, and the staff is more responsible for keeping that in place than anyone, and Pete exemplifies that. So, 26, how was it, 24 years? I forget. 26 total years of service. So I want to recognize that service, and thank you very much. Give him a round of applause. Thank you very much. Resuming the questioning, we will go to Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will also take my turn to ask my parochial and provincial question. My community is home to the Sikorsky facility that manufactures the VH-92, known as Marine One, and you all know that last year Sikorsky announced its intention to close that facility and consolidate operations in other locations. And I, at that time, was a very vocal opponent, joining with other members of our Pennsylvania delegation, asking Sikorsky to reverse that decision and to have an enduring commitment to the city of Coatesville, which is where that factory is. And thankfully, the president also shared this view, and Lockheed announced very soon after, in July in 2019, that it would keep the plant open, and at least as long as it had work on the VH-92 program, it would remain so. So I have two questions. I think probably the Admiral would be most likely the appropriate person to ask the first one. Last year, I placed into Section 133 of the NDAA a requirement for the Navy to report to Congress on its assessment of what the facility's closure would mean for the program, and we received this response in January. And this much of it is the assignment, and this is the answer. And I was a program manager in the Air Force, and I was also a chemistry teacher in 11th grade. And on both counts, I think this would merit an F in terms of effort. And I was wondering if you could maybe provide a little bit more insight onto what the implications would be, because in all likelihood, the factory at some point will be closed and moved, and was hoping you might be able to provide me some more insight than this report does.
Ma'am, I don't think that I signed that report. I don't think that I've seen it. And so if I could take that for the record, or set up a meeting to come back and get schooled in it myself, and then so I can adequately answer your questions.
I would really appreciate that, because I really would love to have a more robust answer to a really important question. And my second question is for General Berger. I understand that the Marine Corps Aviation Plan had originally called for 2 additional CH-92A, which are the trainer aircraft. Having dedicated training aircraft obviously helps to relieve the burden on the regular fleet. And I noticed that funding for this was struck in this budgetary process. And I was wondering if there was a plan for that to eventually be added, why that was decided to be struck, if you could provide some insight into that as well.
The requirement remains 2, ma'am. You're accurate. 1 we have right now down at Quantico, 1 simulator. The requirement is a second one. So that part remains valid. We will need to find the funding for it, because as we field the 92, we're going to need 2 simulators, not 1.
And I guess I appreciate that, elevate my concern that if this particular facility, which is charged currently with this manufacturing, is in fact at some point going to be shuttered because of lack of demand, we really need to make sure we understand that demand shortly so that we don't end up with a difficult problem. That is the bulk of my questions, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned about reports about the Chinese and Russian militaries investing heavily in their submarine fleets, with subs that can deploy longer and have more lethal weapon systems. They are increasing their activity in the North Atlantic region, and at the rate China is building and currently commissioning ships, its Navy could have 100 submarines within the next 15 years. The Navy has validated warfighting requirements of 138 P-8 Poseidons, the only long-range aircraft that can detect and track deep-water submarines, as previously attested to by the Secretary and the Admiral this morning. My question is, has the Navy performed any risk assessment of not reaching the warfighting requirement for P-8s?
Sir, I'd have to get back to you on specifically with respect to P-8s, but I think P-8s would be part of a broader set of capabilities that we would use against that submarine buildup. But I'll have to get back to you with more specifics.
Okay, I appreciate that. Furthermore, what does the shortfall of P-8 mean for the stockpile of associated capabilities that are necessary for anti-submarine warfare missions such as sonobuoys?
Sir, I lost the connection there between sonobuoys and the...
What does the shortfall of P-8s mean for sonobuoys?
So I'm concerned about numbers of sonobuoys and have added that to my unfunded list. In terms of P-8s and the risk there, I think there's a direct risk to warfighting capability and capacity based on numbers. And so I think I can get back to you as part of that previous question and tie it together.
All right, appreciate that very much. You already heard from Representative Moulton a little bit about the Future of Defense Task Force that he and I co-chair. We are working closely with DoD and members of the National Security Innovation Base to identify opportunities to invest in our future force structure. Mr. Secretary, in your testimony, you state, quote, "There is clear agreement that certain new classes of ships that currently do not exist today must be designed and built rapidly in the next 10 years," end quote. What role do you see unmanned undersea vehicles systems playing in a conflict with Russia and China?
Sir, I think they're going to play a role. And I think what we need to do, the work that we need to do now, and this is largely where there are some disagreements between the analysis that we've done, the analysis that CAPE has done, the analysis that think tanks like CSBA has done, is how do you scale, what's the scale of that unmanned piece of the mission? And the numbers vary. From my perspective right now, we're in this point in time, I don't think that difference in numbers is that significant, because we have to get after it now anyway, and it's going to take time to get to that size of force. But I think we all agree that unmanned platforms are going to have a role to play, whether they're undersea unmanned platforms, large ones, medium-sized ones, small ones. They are going to be part of the future force mix that we're going to design.
Can you comment a little bit further on the readiness of U.S. citizens studying STEM professions and how that impacts your ability to prepare the Navy for the future?
I think it's a huge strategic problem for us, that we don't have enough students. We're not generating enough students out of secondary education to meet those needs. I haven't studied it, but I've seen some statistics on it, and when you look at what particularly our biggest long-term competitor is doing, we have significant challenges there. And it limits the types of input that we have into our force.
Okay, I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, in reference to a subject that Congressman Lamborn brought up earlier, what is the Navy's plan to proliferate conventional prompt strike and hypersonic weapons across the force in order to prevent them from being solely held within our submarine force?
Sir, we'd have to come back and give you a classified briefing on that in terms of how we plan on deploying these. There are lots of different options that we're looking at, but I really can't discuss that in an open forum. But we'd be more than happy to come and do that in a classified forum.
We look forward to that. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions, Admiral Gilday. I've sat here throughout this whole hearing just to get to this. Earlier today, you mentioned that Portsmouth is in New Hampshire. I just had to point out that the entrance to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is in Kittery, Maine. And most of that shipyard, you know I wouldn't let you get away with that. Most of the shipyard is in Maine, and we're proud of it and proud to share it with New Hampshire. But more seriously, you've sat in front of the Sea Power Subcommittee in the last year. We've had conversations about your excitement about the DDG Flight 3 and how important getting that platform out into the Navy is. I also noticed that in the FY21 budget request, there's $46 million for industry studies regarding the next large surface combatant, but that is a ways out there. You've testified today about how a lot of the platforms we have right now are going to be with us for a while, and as a result, you're going to be investing in upgrading the systems that you have. And with that in mind, I wanted to remind you that the current multi-year procurement for DDG 51 runs out in FY2022, and therefore wanted to ask both the Secretary and yourself what your plans are regarding an FY23 multi-year procurement contract for DDG 51 Flight 3s.
Right now, sir, I can't speak to a detailed plan for a multi-year procurement of DDG 51 Flight 3s and 23. I think that would really be dependent upon the integrated force structure assessment that we've done, and then prioritizing within that in terms of what we need to move forward on quickly, given the top line that we have. And I don't mean to be evasive, it's just I don't have a firm answer to that yet.
If I may just add to that, the multi-year procurements give us tremendous flexibility to purchase these ships, these long lead time ships, and reduce the cost of them over time. And so we are very much in favor of using that authority whenever we possibly can. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and would love to work with you on that as we plan for the future, because I think you made the point, Mr. Secretary, it drives down the cost of the ships. I'd be surprised. Obviously, I don't know what the force assessment is going to look like, but I've heard an awful lot of good testimony about the importance of the DDG destroyer as the Cadillac of the Navy, the backbone of the force. I'd be shocked to see a dramatic shift. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I think that'd be an interesting conversation. General Berger, I wanted to just ask you, in your planning guidance, you made this quote: Marines cannot be passive passengers en route to the amphibious objective area as long-range precision standoff weapons improve and diffuse along the world's littorals. Marines must contribute to the fight alongside our Navy shipmates from the moment we embark. I also have heard you talk about having a distributed force. You've talked about land-based anti-ship weapons and being able to reach out and touch the enemy. I also can't imagine you envision a Marine Corps infantry that is not able to go ashore and tangle with the best of them. So this is not a gotcha question, but during your nomination, you testified that you would continue the Marine Corps support for the Close Combat Lethality Task Force. I also wanted to point out that Secretary Esper basically committed the same, saying that the cross-functional nature of the CCLTF increases coordination of effort department-wide. For those people listening that don't know, this is an effort to strengthen the lethality, survivability, resiliency, and readiness of U.S. squad-level infantry units to ensure close combat overmatch against pacing threats. Yet there's a proposal to just move this into the Army and not keep it a shared joint services effort. I can't imagine that much has changed, but I did want to ask because it seems like a pretty rapid shift away from where we were just 6 months ago.
Sir, we benefited from the work they've done so far because we were part of it. And inside this budget, plus a very small unfunded priority list for the Marine Corps, 44% of that unfunded stuff is individual Marine stuff, from the individual combat equipment for reservists to suppressors and night optics. But we have been the beneficiary of that. We have to continue that. We cannot let that flounder again. Not because we're going to put 10,000 Marines across a beach. We're not going to relive 1944 or 1945, but because the way you describe it, we have to first deter, but if that doesn't work, be prepared to distribute a force ashore or afloat, either one. And then it's going to always boil down to a small unit leader, and we have to outfit that small unit leader and his team with the very best we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mr. Walls.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Modly, before I get into my broader strategic and parochial questions, I just wanted to note that several members of the Florida delegation wrote you regarding the awarding of Purple Hearts to those wounded during the December terrorist attack on Pensacola NAS, and asking you to review whether any of those personnel merit Valor Awards as a combat veteran. I certainly saw valor in the actions of many to protect their fellow sailors and civilians. So I understand the Valor Awards are still under review, but I wanted to thank you for awarding several Purple Hearts to the victims of that horrific attack. I just want to echo quickly my colleagues, Representative Gallego, Representative Banks, the concerns of the burgeoning qualitative and quantitative Chinese and Russian fleets. Lots of discussion of the Virginia, lots of discussion of the Columbia. Obviously, that's a key part of our deterrent. Moscow and Beijing, I think, feel the same way. So taking a look at the P-8s and just following up on Representative Banks, we have a reserve squadron. The P-3s are so old that I guess we're retiring those even without replacements. Well, what's the bottom line and where you need to go on the total numbers of P-8s and how and when are we going to get there? And I know that is a piece of the ASW fight, but I think it's a pretty critical one.
Sir, we're not abandoning P3s without a replacement. So P8s are coming online and replacing those P3s. In the late 20s, that inventory will be closed, fully closed.
Admiral, my understanding is that the reserve squadron in Jacksonville, Florida, is going to decommission before they get P8s. If we could, I would be happy to be wrong on that. If you could just follow up for the record.
I will come back to you on that, sir. But I also take a look at whether or not that's being replaced in a different area with a different squadron. But I'll get back to you.
Thank you. And then on the sonobuoy piece, and again, you could take this for the record as well if you don't have the detail. As we looked at it, you request $49 million to recapitalize the newest version, the SSQ 125A. My understanding, that's not in production yet. So we're confused on basically, if you could come back to us and explain why we're recapping a sonobuoy that's not in production versus replenishing the stocks and continuing to replenish the stocks, which I think this committee has supported you in doing in the last few years, but that seems to us to be a disconnect for replenishing something that's not in production yet. If you could come back to us on that, I'd appreciate it, Admiral. And then, I just have a broader strategic top-line question that I'm asking of all of the services. I mean, and the Secretary and Chairman. We're looking at a flat top-line budget. We're looking at increasing personnel costs. I still am not clear, and I think this is the broader strategic question we're all asking. How are we going to modernize? How are we going to recap? And how are we going to procure when our personnel costs continue in the out year and the fight up to eat up more and more of a flat top line? I'm having trouble kind of circling that square. If you could speak to that. And then in the time remaining, I completely agree. There's a quality and quantity. Are you looking at any types of pulling anything out of mothball or modernizing any from the hazard frigates or anything along those lines of kind of really getting out of the box to keep up with the pace that the Chinese are cranking out ships?
So I think, sir, the best way to answer that first question from my perspective is we have to look internally at our own organization. And there are many things that we do, the way we operate, the way our business processes are set up, the business system structures that we have that inhibit our organization to be as agile as it needs to be. And there's cost associated with that. There are overhead structures that are associated with that we don't need to have. And we need to funnel that into modernization. I think ultimately we can dig very deep to find some of that, but at some point there's going to have to be a broader discussion about a higher top line for the Navy. And that's something that I'm trying to queue up, but I can't.
Just in the time, thank you for that candor. And the other piece, again, I'm on the Future Defense Task Force as well in my remaining 10 seconds. If we're moving long-term to more and more lightly manned and unmanned systems, but we have the long-term personnel costs that are eating up that budget, if you could come back for the record of where those intersections come, is it 5 years, 10 years, and how do we accelerate it?
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
And I think a number of members have hit upon this point, but I think that is a crucial question, is making the budget work for what we want to do. Make sure we don't overextend ourselves so we wind up not doing anything well. If we have the money, we have the money. If we don't, we have to figure out how to make it work. And I think a lot of us, and you as well, are struggling to get the right answers on that. And that will inform a lot of what we do in this year's defense bill. Ms. Laurie.
Secretary Modly, I wanted to start with a comment that you made recently, and this is a quote. You said, "The service needs to settle on a North Star and begin the research and development and construction to get the hulls in the water, and then it could refine its vision as needed once fleet leaders understand how the new and old ships work together to bring naval power to a distributed fight." So, I read this, and what do you think it sounds like to me? It sounds like the LCS program, the DDG 1000, it sounds like the Ford, it sounds like the conversations we're having about unmanned surface vessels. So, I just wanted to point out the fact that, we've had class after class after class of ship procurement and construction that has essentially failed. And it's failed us in providing national defense, presence, deterrence overseas, and it's failed the sailors who are working on those ships. They're the ones who are doing the right thing, but we're giving them platforms that can't do the job, that are not fully developed, that are not mature and designed before we start building them. And so in that discussion, I want to discuss the LCS.
So in 2018, Vice Admiral Brown, Commander Naval Surface Forces, said, these ships bring unmatched capability to our surface navy and provide flexibility to our fleet commanders. So in your assessment, do you agree with Vice Admiral Brown that these have brought us unmatched flexibility? And would you say the LCS is a success or a failure?
Well, ma'am, I think it's too early to say whether or not they're a success or a failure.
Well, no,
I think right
it's
now,
too early to tell. You want to decommission the first 4 ships in the class, and it's too early to tell. We're going to go through, and we're going to start decommissioning them when the oldest one is 12 years old. And I'll quote Admiral Gilday gave, I think, a good assessment of what they turned out to be at the Shipbuilding Caucus breakfast a couple weeks ago, that they were just prototypes, because we built them and then we figured out that they didn't work. So is this like a we'll build it and then they'll come mentality that the Navy has? Is this your plan for the FFG, the large surface combatant? What is the plan of the Navy to develop platforms and ships that actually do the mission? And I'm going to stop there because it's a somewhat rhetorical question and can never be possibly answered in 5 minutes. But what I'm going to move on to is this entire discussion about 355 ships. So since I've been here, what I've been talking about is how did we get to the 355 number? We got to it through the OFRP. And the OFRP moved us from deploying 6 out of every 24 months, so 25% of the time, to 6 out of every 36 months, 17% of the time. I'm not that smart with math, but I am a Navy nuke, and I can do the math backwards, and 355, if you do the math backwards, at 25% of the time, it works out you only needed 282 ships to do the same thing presence-wise before you went down in the amount of time they're deployed. So honestly, a force structure assessment and a 30-year shipbuilding plan that are based off of an assumption that we're only going to deploy approximately 17% of the time, or 6 or 7 out of 36 months, it doesn't work. It gets us to 355. And I've been struggling to do your math because you said we could get to 355 ships by the end of this decade. I mean, do you have proof that our industrial base could even do that if we threw all the money that the taxpayers had at it? Would it even be physically possible?
I think it's possible, and I mentioned before, ma'am, what I
So
think it
it's
would
possible in the plan that we haven't seen yet. It tells us how to get to 355 in a decade.
take. I will be able to tell you how I think we can get there. Yes, ma'am. But many of your points are valid, but some aren't. The first 2 LCS ships were not designed to be operational ships. They were test ships.
Is that what was testified to Congress when you came and asked us to pay a bill? And the American taxpayer to pay for ships, you told us you wanted to build 2 ships that weren't going to be operational, that were never going to deploy, and then you send sailors there and expect them to operate these and put all of their blood, sweat, and tears into operating the ships that are never going to deploy?
The first 2 were purchased with R&D dollars, which meant they were research and development ships. So I think I was not here.
Okay,
but
so then
that
are they
sounds
being
to me like it
counted?
was
If
pretty
they're
clear that
R&D
it
ships and they're just prototype test platforms, are you counting them in the 293 of 355 that we have right now?
They're part of the
Are they
mix.
operational fleet ships?
Yeah, yes.
So then I don't buy that answer. They're operational fleet ships. They can't deploy. We were going to have warfare modules for them. They were going to bring us a whole bunch of capability, but guess what? We didn't even develop those, and we're still not operational at this point. Is that correct?
Some of them are. Some of them are operating right now. Some of them are doing operations out in the South China Sea right now. So they're out there and they're doing things.
So they're out there and they're doing things. So was it the agile, flexible platform that was going to solve all the Navy's problems? When I see this mystery 30-year shipbuilding plan, is it all LCSs?
No, ma'am, and I don't think anyone ever said they were going to solve all the Navy's problems. I think it was a new capability that would address certain problems in certain areas that other more expensive ships, that it was too expensive to do with those other ships. That's what it was designed to do.
Time has expired. I think this is an incredibly important point, and a much more forceful and articulate way of getting at what I was trying to get at in my opening statement is the 355 number kind of offends me because it doesn't get into this, and this is what matters. You could have 355 rowboats, theoretically, and you'd have 355 ships. So I don't even know why we put that number out there. I would much rather see, here are the capabilities that we need to have. And, yes, I take your point about R&D ships, but you can't really count an R&D ship as part of the 355 ship fleet if you're being honest about it, or if you're not just trying to hit an artificial number. It's about the capabilities. And also, I think and you gentlemen have worked very hard on this and made it better, it's about, okay, we have it, can we use it? And that's really important. And I know you focused on that. You focused on the maintenance. You focused on those issues. That just seems to me like a lot more important than spending all your time, trying to come up with some chart that shows we can get to 355 ships. The point is much more the capabilities and the deployability. Just my 2 cents worth. Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I tailing Charlie here?
I beg your pardon?
Am I the last man standing?
At the moment, though, you never know who's going to show up.
Well, potentially then, the only thing standing between you all and what you're going to get onto next today, I'll try to be short, sweet, and to the point, but it will take 5 minutes. So the point is, historically, we have heard the phrase used, there is no one more adaptable and creative than a Marine in a firefight. Conversely, personal experience tells me there is no one less adaptable than that same Marine within a change-resistant bureaucracy. As I look at today's DoD and service bureaucracies, I see experienced, motivated, digitally savvy young service members held back by analog bureaucrats who are change-resistant. That's just the perspective of 40 years in uniform, whether it be active duty or reserve. There's good news, because we have these service members, these young men and women, who they're there to fight. They're there to defend our country's interests at all costs. It's up to us to do the right thing to enable them, and then not stifle them after they've gotten the experience that they can be productive in a changing environment that is always going to be changing. So, General Berger, I know it was mentioned before I got here, you're going to propose the Marine Corps is proposing cuts of about 2,000 personnel in the FY21 budget request. You've indicated what your goal is. I guess my question is, with the proposed cuts to manning, is the Marine Corps considering increased use of shared services, whether it be on the admin side, the fiscal side, where you don't need commands at all levels to have that completely filled out shop, that you can actually streamline your outputs for, again, HR stuff and fiscal stuff by utilizing the shared services. Can you want to make a comment, or are you ready to, and if you're not, I mean, we can talk about it, take it for the record, because I'd like to hear what you're thinking.
The force design efforts started with the warfighting end. So most of the adjustments to how we're built had to do with warfighting, and part of that, to your point, sir, was where we ought to integrate with the Navy in a personnel manner. In other words, at the numbered fleet, do we have it right? Because right now, today, a numbered fleet has one Marine colonel. We got to do a lot different than that going forward. So it's not for the sake of efficiencies, it's for the sake of warfighting. After that, where do we go inside the Title 10 headquarters, all of the headquarters between us and a battalion squadron? We have to look at all of that, yes. Have we looked at it through the lens of where we could deliberately look for services elsewhere? We have not yet, no.
Okay, thank you. And also for both, and again, not necessarily to be answered right now, but for both Admiral Gilday and General Berger, we now use the term operational reserve, because since we can go back in the history since after Korea, where we didn't populate the Guard and Reserve with equipment or resources necessary to keep them ready to the point where if we needed to use them, they were ready to go when we needed them. Well, the last 20 plus years, we have seen the value of an operational reserve. So having said that, when we think about HDLD assets, high demand, low density, quick turn on the deployments, things, and now we're talking active component assets, Intel, cyber, IT, for example. We know we're not going to keep those corporals and sergeants because the pay is too good and the opportunity is too great in the outside world, so we train them up. They serve their time honorably. They do the job well. So I would just encourage you to be looking at how do you take those highly trained, capable assets and keep their viability? It's different in an infantry battalion, but those kind of assets we need to keep for as long as possible. And there's only one place to keep them if they leave active duty, and that's a reserve capability, appropriately led by people who understand what it takes to be a reservist who is committed to a career after their service. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we are done, but thank you, gentlemen, very much. Appreciate your service, appreciate your testimony, and we'll continue to work on this as we prepare the bill for this year. And with that, we are adjourned.